In Jungian psychology, the shadow is the part of the unconscious that contains all of those characteristics the conscious mind considers dark or bad. If the conscious mind thinks aggression is wrong, then the shadow is the part of the personality that is aggressive. Jung believed this was how we cope with having to act in ways we would prefer not to. A healthy personality has a shadow and soul in balance. Mickey Cohen was Ben Bugsy Siegel's shadow. Ben was tall, handsome, suave, and welcome in the elite Hollywood circles. He mixed with the glitterati, courted royalty, and bedded starlets, while his shadow, Mickey, was picking their pockets, robbing their safes, and breaking their bones. In so many ways, they were opposite sides of the same coin. Both were violent men, out of place in the Hollywood environment. They liked many of the same things: good food, fine clothes, beautiful women, and shined shoes. But where Benny was able to submerge his dark side and present a more acceptable persona, Mickey was what he was. He was loud, boisterous, and pedestrian. He made no apologies for his lifestyle and his lack of refinement. Together, Mickey Cohen and Benny Siegel were an effective extension of the East Coast Syndicate on the West Coast. They changed organized crime in the West from the backwater Unione Siciliano Blackhand penny ante operations that had existed under the old-style Mustache Pete's into the multi-million-dollar industry that controlled narcotics, gambling, unions, and politics. After Benny was punished by his syndicate partners for skimming from the Flamingo Project, Mickey Cohen was left alone as the mob's West Coast muscle and easily filled Ben's shoes. He didn't have the flair of Ben Siegel, but Mickey Cohen had a style all his own. Mickey flourished on the West Coast and appeared to have more lives than a cat. He was shot at, bombed, arrested, imprisoned, threatened, and like the fighter he started out as, Mickey kept coming back for more. In the end, he outlasted all of his enemies and went out, if not on top, then pretty darn close. Because organized crime seems to be an East Coast phenomenon, Mickey Cohen never really got the recognition that he deserved. That's a shame, because Mickey was a bit of a rarity. In a business where most guys end up in a prison cell or at the wrong end of a gun, Mickey Cohen managed to avoid both of those pitfalls. One of the reasons Mickey didn't get the recognition that other men he worked with did was because Mick was a second-generation mobster. Just like no one remembers the people who arrived in America on the next boat after the Mayflower, Mickey showed up in Chicago long after Al Capone had seized control of the underworld. And by the time Mickey came west to join Ben Siegel, Bugsy had already infiltrated the extras union and shown Jack Dragna, who was boss in California. Mickey's rise to power came after the heyday of the Jewish mobsters. Meyer Lansky was well established in Havana and the Southeast, and was looking forward to retiring. The carpet joints were flourishing in Louisiana. Frank Costello was firmly ensconced as the prime minister, and there was really no new world to be plundered. The conquistadors had come and gone, and it was Mickey's job to oversee the operations that had been put into place. He did that with the skill and practice of a journeyman gangster. Mickey may not have been an A-list racketeer, but he was efficient and ruthless at his craft. Like Sam Giancana in Chicago, he paid his dues as a hired gun, worked his way up the chain of command, and saw the traps and tricks that had foiled those in front of him. By the time he was in a position to run his own operation, Mickey Cohen was as adroit and cunning as the men he succeeded. Even though the trail had been blazed before him, Mickey Cohen's rise to the top wasn't easy. He had to pay his dues, and he got his start in the rackets like a number of other wise guys, in the ring. The things that make a good pug and a good gangster are similar. An imposing presence, tough fists, and a chin that can take a punch are important characteristics for a racketeer, although the imposing presence is mostly for character. Many of the mob's toughest characters were small men who made up for their diminutive stature with guts and heart that belonged in guys twice their size. Meyer Lansky and Lepke Buchalter are two that come to mind, although this trait is not limited to Jewish gangsters. Though Westies, Mickey Featherstone, wasn't all that big, and he was known for his rock-solid fists and the tenacity of a Jack Russell Terrier. The Genovese family leaders Punchy Iliano and Quiet Dom Cirillo both got their starts as boxers, as did another Genovese member, Lil Augie Pisano. Iliano earned his nickname because of his boxing background, and those who know him insist he is anything but punchy. For his part, Cirillo faced Jake Raging Bull LaMotta in the ring several times, although he was less than successful. Mickey Cohen was born hustling, a Brownsville, New York native, the same neighborhood that gave the world Abe Reilly's and many of the Murder, Inc. troupe. Cohen was whisked away from the poverty of that Brooklyn slum before he was 6 years old and moved with his mother and older siblings to the Boyle Heights section of Los Angeles, where his family operated a drugstore. Of course, this being Prohibition, the Cohen Pharmacy, in the middle of a Russian Orthodox Jewish neighborhood, operated one of the countless small-time gin mills in the area. As a boy, Mickey served as a delivery man for his brother's moonshine operation, which resulted in his first pinch at 9 years old. The charge was smoothed over by his brother's connections, and nothing came of it. But the seed had already been planted in Mickey's mind. "I got a kick out of having a big bankroll in my pocket," he said in his biography. "Even if I only made a couple of $100s, I'd always keep it in 5s and 10s so it'd look big. I had to hide it from my mother because she gets excited when she sees a roll of money like that. Successful hustling, whether it's bootlegging, selling newspapers, or swag, requires moxie and the fists to back it up. And that's how the preteen Mickey discovered he liked to box. Although the sport was illegal in California, and even more so because he was so young, Mickey found many different ways to get in the ring. Along with the money it gave him, he found he also liked the respect he earned. As he grew, Mickey continued boxing, and with the blissful ignorance of youth, his thoughts turned toward becoming a professional. The skill was there, as were the promoters who saw something special in the young teen. The only problem was that 15-year-old Mickey Cohen's mother didn't know he was boxing at all. One day, the butcher stopped my mother, who didn't talk really good English, and said to her, "Mrs. Cohen, you must be proud your boy's boxing for the championship." So she says, "What's this boxing?" See, she didn't know anything about boxing or that sort of thing. Mickey won the championship, and that sealed it in his mind. With the blessing of his older brother, he told his mother he was going to the beach and headed east to become a prize fighter. Fate had other ideas. Mick bounced around the Midwest for a while and landed in New York, where he met some of organized crime's toughest characters. Tommy DioGuardi, brother of the labor racketeer Johnny Dio, was a fight fanatic, as was Oni Madden, the New York killer who would end up running the mob's resort in Hot Springs, Arkansas. A man of his word, Mickey recalled later. His faithfulness to his own kind is the strongest thing a man can have, and if Oni felt that you were an all-right person, there was nothing that he wouldn't do for you. A bad bout with featherweight world champ Tommy Paul ended Mick's boxing career when the champ knocked him so senseless he wandered out of the ring and was on his way to the dressing room before anyone could catch him. "I began to see that I really didn't have it to be great in the ring," he said. "So then I decided I'd had enough of the fight business and everything else." A washed-up pug with no education whose only friends are gangsters has few choices in life. That's where Mickey found himself after his fight with Tommy Paul. He fell back on the only thing he knew: hustling. "I started rooting, sticking up joints with some older guys," he said. "By now, I had gotten a taste of what the racket world really was, the glamour, the way they dressed, the way they always had a pocket full of money. He didn't realize it at the time, but the places he was robbing were mob-controlled carpet joints, the illicit nightclubs, and casinos that predated Las Vegas. Later on, I learned that we were lucky to pull it through," he recalled, "because we didn't even give a thought to whose joints those were. We were stepping on the toes of the outfit. Fortunately for Mickey, the mobsters whose toes were crushed realized the rough talent he had and set him straight. After a killing, he preferred not to talk about statute of limitations and all that. He said Mickey moved from Cleveland to Chicago, where he later met Al Capone. In the Windy City, Mickey, working as a muscle in a card room, learned how influential the outfit had become. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and when a couple of thugs died in a shootout, Mick was pinched. "I certainly ain't going to get out right away," he thought to himself, and laid on the bench to sleep. A telephone call from his Goomba, Egan's rat member Spike Hennessy, to a police captain changed that, and Mickey was out on the streets without having to post bail. The charges then seemed to disappear. "These guys were notorious anyway, and besides, they had a piece on them," Mickey explained. It was after that that Mickey met Al Capone for the first time. "I walked into his office kind of awed because I was a young kid anyway, walking into the office of Al Capone," he said. he did something which was a very big thing for me. He kind of held my head and kissed me on both cheeks. That greeting solidified Mickey Cohen's place in the Chicago outfit and led to bigger and better things, mostly on the gambling side of the outfit's operations. Mickey was soon running card games and then craps tables and supervising other mobsters. He was close to Matty Capone, Big Al's younger brother, and with Matty's backing, Mickey found he could get away with things other mobsters couldn't. Al intimated to me like if I found something to get into, he would back me up, you understand? While he was working under greasy-thumb Jake Guzik, Al's bagman, Mickey experienced the first of what would be many assassination attempts. Not surprisingly, the details of the attack were etched firmly in Mick's mind. I had on a camel hair coat that boy I was really in love with, he recalled. It had a big check in it. Not a loud check, and I think this was the second time I had worn it. So when they came by shooting, I didn't even fall because I didn't want to get my coat dirty. A beef with another gambler made Mickey leave town, and for a while, he was working back with Lou Rothkopf in Cleveland, a close friend of Meyer Lansky and Benny Siegel. There wasn't enough work for a guy like Mickey in Cleveland, so Lou and his friend Joe Gentile suggested Mickey head west to work with Ben. Los Angeles was a good 30 years behind in many aspects of organized crime. In fact, crime in Southern California was barely organized at all. Jack Dragna was running things with very little input from the national syndicate, and most of his operations consisted of immigrant shakedowns and gambling ships which took players outside the 12-mile national limit to gamble on the high seas. Dragna reluctantly accepted Lucky Luciano's admonition that Ben Siegel was heading west for his health and the health of us all, but Dragna didn't like playing second fiddle to Ben Siegel. Mob scholar Carl Sifakis refers to Jack Dragna as a man who thought small. A native of Corleone, Sicily, he bounced back and forth between Sicily and America from 1898 to 1914, when he returned to Southern California to stay. Dragna quickly fell in with the Unione Siciliano, a legitimate, benevolent, and protective organization for immigrants that had been subsumed by mobsters into a protection and shakedown racket. Dragna was the visible frontman for the Unione, but his interest was clearly criminal and his abilities limited. One of Dragna's favorite scams was to sell protection and then send in some goons to threaten the marks. When they came to Dragna for help, he'd charge them extra to chase away his own people. That way, he caught the victims coming and going. Dragna wasn't above murder, though. When the scheme backfired and the victim wanted his tormentor rubbed out, Dragna instead had the victim killed. What makes a mobster successful is presence and follow-through. A tough guy who walks into a joint and looks intimidating is one thing, but following up on the promised threat is essential. A mobster who is incapable of showing he has the power and guts to pull off a beating just looks pathetic. This is the problem Jack Dragna had. Independent bookmakers knew that Jack was in no position to shake them down, so when he demanded protection money from them, they shrugged it off without repercussions. Dragna rose to the top among the homegrown California mobsters only because he was the best of a poor lot, Sifakis wrote. Along with mobster Johnny Roselli, another of Al Capone's friends, Dragna created the offshore gambling industry. Roselli and Dragna gutted a schooner, the Monfalcone, and put in an orchestra pit, gambling rooms, and sports racing book. The ship was an instant hit with the Los Angeles in-crowd, and unlike speakeasies, where somebody had to know somebody and everything was hush-hush, the gambling ships openly touted their operations on billboards and advertisements. The Monfalcone caught fire and was scuttled, but the gambling ship industry was a Dragna Roselli staple for years. Jack was very powerful and very well respected, Mickey said of Dragna, but he got lackadaisical. He wasn't able to put things together to the satisfaction of the Eastern people, or even keep things together to their satisfaction. Dragna didn't work the political angles like Frank Costello did on the East Coast, or even like Al Capone in Chicago, and that made it difficult to keep operations going. The protection that owning a politician or two provides is essential, and Dragna was unable to pull this together. The syndicate knew that Los Angeles was worth the effort, and that's another reason they sent Ben Siegel out there. The relationship between the Chicago and New York mobs put a strain on the syndicate, and California was the fault line. There was respect, but little love between the forces of Al Capone and later Tony Accardo and the five families of New York, plus the Jewish mobsters. When Ben Siegel came west to set up the syndicate's wire services there, the tremors were felt all over the country. Dragna was backed by Tony Accardo after Capone went to prison, but the Chicago outfit was not tough enough to extend enough protection to L.A. to keep New York away. Johnny and Jimmy Roselli chafed under the direction of Benny Siegel, but were smart enough not to take him on directly. In many cases, their wrath was directed at his number two, Mickey Cohen. If having to put up with two Jewish mobsters with the backing of Lucky Luciano wasn't bad enough for Dragna, having those mobsters start pushing an alternative wire service for bookies was. Dragna and Roselli were backing James Reagan's Continental Press Service, while Cohen and Siegel were pushing the transcontinental wire. The stakes were high, with bookies paying anywhere from $100 to $1,200 a week for access to wire service race information depending on their own handle. Under Benny's direction, Cohen and his boys busted up a Continental office, breaking heads and tearing out phone lines. Eventually, Benny had Reagan killed in Chicago. Benny Siegel's knocking over Continental was kind of a slap in the face to Dragna and Roselli, Cohen said, because they thought they were running the West Coast. Dragna was really from the old mustache days. The worst thing you can do to an old-time Italian Mayhoff is to harm his prestige in any way. And that's what took place when Benny came out here. For years, Bugsy Siegel's presence in Los Angeles served as a firewall between Jack Dragna and Mickey Cohen. But Ben wasn't going to be around much longer, and when he was gone, Dragna had no trouble finding the courage to feud openly with Mickey. When Ben headed to Nevada with Virginia Hill and a couple million of his mob friends' dollars, Mickey stayed in Southern California to oversee the syndicate's operations there. Vegas and I disagreed, so I had to push myself to go there, Cohen wrote. But I had an understanding with the Cleveland people that being out this way, I would make myself available from time to time in Las Vegas for pieces of work. The day before Siegel's 1947 execution, he met with Mickey to discuss the situation in the West. The Flamingo's opening had already been a disaster, and the casino was limping along woefully, although it was beginning to turn a profit, as the law of large numbers caught up with the players and the casino edge began to take hold. Still, Mickey knew that Ben suspected his time was at hand. He asked about the armaments the operation had in Los Angeles, and what shooters loyal to him were on hand. There's no doubt that Benny felt there was some kind of come-off going to take place, Cohen said. I guess he wanted to be prepared for it, but he wasn't prepared soon enough. Before Ben had a chance to set up a defense, he was shot to death as he sat in a Southern California bungalow. The long-range sniper was so accurate, his shot blew one of Ben's eyes clear across the room. No one was ever arrested for the hit, although Mickey had his suspicions of who ordered it and who fired the shot. Because he wanted to stay alive even after retiring from the rackets, Mickey mentions no names in his autobiography. But he suggests that the hit was done without pay as a favor for the men who requested it. Immediately after the hit, it was business as usual. Mo Sedway and Doc Stasher took over the Flamingo hours after Ben was killed, and Mickey received his own orders from the syndicate. I took over from Benny right away on instructions from the people back east, he said. Naturally, I missed Benny, but to be honest with you, his getting knocked off was not a bad break for me. Pretty soon I was running everything out here. As the syndicate man on the West Coast, Mickey began meeting with the movers and shakers of Hollywood and the top politicians of Los Angeles. He did favors for Harry Cohn, head of Columbia Studios, and for Frank Sinatra, who was hot for Ava Gardner, but was being beaten out by Cohen gunman Johnny Stompanato. Mickey developed lifelong friendships with men like Sammy Davis Jr. and stepped in to defend Davis when Cohn wanted Frank Costello to have the entertainer whacked for dating Kim Novak. Another relationship, which was to have ramifications much later in Mickey's life, was his friendship with William Randolph Hearst, who ordered his Los Angeles Times editors to stop referring to Cohen as a hoodlum and to start calling him a gambler. But none of the Hollywood types or even the police commission in his pocket could help Mickey when Jack Dragna declared war. Before Bugsy's bones were cold in the ground, Dragna began plotting against Mickey Cohen. It was now or never, Jack reasoned, and he pulled out all the stops to get Mickey out of the way. A combination of uncanny luck on Mickey's part and incompetence on the part of the Dragna crew made the War of the Sunset Strip look like a Hollywood comedy. One of the first salvos was fired as Mickey was heading home to Brentwood and was ambushed. Under fire from shotguns and Tommy guns, the hit looked like one of those unbelievable scenes in a movie where the bad guys open up on the star with a platoon of heavy weapons, yet the star manages to avoid every shot. In Mick's case, it was really happening. As the glass exploded from his Cadillac, he lay on his side and managed to steer his car up Wilshire Boulevard without hitting anything. "I'm probably at my coolest in an emergency," he said. "The minute I sensed what was happening, I fell to the floor and drove that goddamn car all the way down Wilshire with one hand. I probably couldn't do it again in 1,000 times." He escaped with just a little damage from flying glass. Twice, Dragna tried to get Mickey in his home, the first time using a Bangalore, a long, tube-like explosive device used by the military to clear barbed wire and beachheads, but the TNT failed to detonate. The next time, a dynamite bomb exploded beneath the Cohen house, but the blast was directed away from the living space by a concrete floor vault that shielded Mickey and his family. "Actually, the neighbors got it worse than I did from the concussion," he recalled. Sharpshooting hit men were only slightly luckier. Once, as Mickey and several friends were sitting in a crowded after-hours diner, a Dragna shooter opened up with a .36 rifle and hit Mickey in the arm, tearing away much of the flesh. Buckshot from another gunman ripped through the diner, striking a couple of innocent patrons and injuring them slightly. Unfortunately, Nettie Herbert, a longtime friend of Mickey's, was killed in the shootout. Another shooter was even less fortunate. Mick was coming out of a joint and was walking toward his new caddy. He bent down to examine a scratch on the fender, and as he did so, felt a bullet whiz past his head and ricochet off the car. The gunman didn't stick around for another shot. In 1950, the war attracted the attention of the Senate Select Committee on Organized Crime in Interstate Commerce, better known as the Kefauver Committee. Mickey was subpoenaed to testify before the commission and was lambasted by New Hampshire Senator Charles Tobey. "I remember the old senator kept calling me a hoodlum. He really used some terms that were uncalled for, from a senator and that type of thing," Cohen said. "Is it not a fact that you live extravagantly, surrounded by violence?" the New Hampshire senator asked Mickey. "What do you mean, surrounded by violence?" Mickey replied, indignant. "People are shooting at me." The exchange and appearance did little for Mickey, and based on the findings of the Kefauver Commission, he was indicted, tried, and convicted of income tax evasion and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. While Mickey was doing time at McNeil Island, his friend Johnny Stompanato began dating actress Lana Turner. The relationship would have profound, life-changing implications for everyone involved. To the end, Mickey denied that John Stompanato was a gangster or even a bodyguard. He claimed Stompanato was just a close associate who dabbled in that gray area that straddles the line between legal and unlawful. Stompanato was a handsome, intense former Marine who managed to always find a wealthy woman to support him. His services were not for sale as such, but it would not be unfair to call him a gigolo. Lana Turner was beautiful, wealthy, and very high maintenance. She was an alcoholic with a track record of attracting the wrong men, and was known for her whirlwind romances and quick marriages, followed by equally quick divorces. The Stompanato-Turner combination was electric and doomed almost from the get-go, but neither Lana nor Johnny could break away. They fought continuously, loved passionately, and intimidated each other, but the two dominant personalities were attracted like moths to a flame, with equally tragic results. There was no love lost between Mickey Cohen and Lana Turner, however. Since each was close to Johnny, they saw the other regularly, and Lana, whom Mickey said was possessive, blamed Mickey when Johnny failed to come when she called. Stompanato told Mickey over and over about his feelings for Lana Turner, so when Mickey received the telephone call that Lana's daughter, Cheryl Crane, had stabbed Johnny to death, he was shocked. "I hung up the phone and drove over to Lana's home and pulled into the driveway, and Jerry Geisler, the lawyer, is coming out," Mickey remembered. "He says, 'If Lana sees you, she's going to fall out altogether. John's dead. The body's at the morgue.'" Mickey was the one to break the news to Johnny's family in Illinois and was asked by the family to make the necessary arrangements. As he sat in the morgue, Mickey began to have his doubts about the story he had been told about how Johnny was killed. "I don't believe Cheryl killed him," he said. "I don't want to outright accuse anyone, but I don't believe it was Cheryl or Lana who did this thing. Somebody must have come in somehow and stabbed him." The feud between Lana and Mickey simmered, and with the backing of the studio, Lana let it be known she was afraid that Mickey would seek revenge. Mickey called Lana on the story, and she blamed the studios. But days later, the pair made headlines again when they showed up at the same restaurant, and Lana, spotting Mickey before he saw her, fled through the kitchen exit. Mickey said he was angered by the beating Johnny took in the press and struck back by releasing the letters Lana wrote to Johnny to the press. They showed a different relationship between the lovers than what was being portrayed by the media. The plan backfired when it appeared Mickey was trying to blackmail Turner, but he maintained it was merely to show the truth about how Lana felt about John Stompanato. In the end, Cheryl Crane was not found criminally responsible for John's death. Mickey bemoaned the coroner's jury verdict in the press. "This is the first time I've ever heard of a guy being convicted of his own murder," he said. Mickey's relationship with the Hearst family put the aging gangster back in the limelight for a final time after heiress Patricia Hearst was kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army, a group of American terrorists who viewed successful capitalists as the enemy of the people. The Hearst family was a prime target for the SLA, as the family's media empire stretched from coast to coast and brought in hundreds of millions of dollars. Shortly after Patty was snatched in 1974, Mickey was approached by a representative of the Hearst family for assistance. They wanted him involved because he was well thought of in the black community, he wrote. "I was involved in gambling in other days in the black community," Mickey wrote. "I have a lot of friends there that love me and whom I love dearly." The friends Mickey referred to, of course, were the numbers runners and others connected to the black underground who might have been able to get a line on SLA leader and former convict Donald DeFreeze. Cohen visited one possible link in Soledad prison, but nothing came of that. After DeFreeze died in a Los Angeles shootout, Cohen was again contacted to see if he could intervene. "I reached 3 young people who were SLA members, or at least associated with them," he wrote. "It became a real cloak and dagger operation. We met at night in different places, changing cars all the time." Cohen had 4 meetings with people connected with Patty Hearst when she was on the run from the law and used his underworld connections, both black and white, to try to track her down. "I kinda had a sixth sense and a hunch, so the next day, after one meeting, I called some people in Cleveland," Cohen recounts. "Can you run it down and see if that little girl, Patty Hearst, happens to be around there anywhere?" A day and a half later, "Goddamn if the word doesn't come back to me about her maybe being there." Cohen then negotiated with his SLA contacts, but it became clear Patty, who was in Cleveland as Cohen suspected, wasn't coming back willingly. When the SLA implied that Mickey's people were looking at another shootout, self-interest took over and he backed off. "I'm on parole, and that's all I needed for a goddamn shootout to happen and somebody getting killed," he said. The whole thing fell apart, Mickey said, when Catherine and Randolph Hearst, Patty's parents, told him they didn't know if bringing Patty back was such a good idea because they couldn't guarantee she wouldn't go to prison. Cohen's mobster ethics took over, and he ended his involvement then and there. "I don't want to be rude," Cohen told the family, "but I gotta beg off this thing. If the situation is such that you folks don't know whether she's going to prison or not, I don't want no part of it." One thing Mickey Cohen didn't do well was prison time. He was a fastidious dresser who liked to keep clean, so prison togs and weekly showers were torturous for him. When he went to prison for a second tax evasion conviction in the early 1960s, he made up his mind that he was going straight when he got out. Passing up an opportunity to buy his freedom by ratting on Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo, Mickey was sentenced to 15 years in prison in 1961 and immediately was sent to Alcatraz. "This Alcatraz is unbelievable in the United States of America," he wrote. "It was a crumbling dungeon. At the time I was in Alcatraz, it was only for personal enemies of Bobby Kennedy. After Alcatraz closed, Mickey was sent to Atlanta, where he took over the electrical shop from Vito Genovese, a friend of his. In 1963, a crazed inmate named Estes McDonald clobbered Mickey from behind with an iron pipe, damaging his brain and partially paralyzing him. From there, he was sent to Springfield, Missouri, to the Federal Prison Hospital. On January 6, 1972, an aging Mickey Cohen was released from Springfield and returned home to California. He was mobile, but barely so, and only able to walk with the help of a walker. His release started what would be fair to call a farewell tour, because he went from Springfield to Hot Springs, Arkansas, to pay his respects to the widow of Oni Madden, and from there to New Orleans, where Mickey spent time with Carlos Marcello. He said hello to some friends from the Cleveland mob, and finally stopped in Vegas. Then it was back home and retirement. He stayed out of the spotlight, eating with friends, occasionally speaking to the media on this or that, and following the fight game. Mickey hadn't stepped foot in a ring in almost 50 years, but he never lost his love of boxing. Until the Patty Hearst incident brought him back into the public eye, he lay low and tried to keep out of trouble. The last thing he wanted was more trouble with the IRS. "I live as I lived before, but I'm not into what you would call any action," Mickey wrote. "I don't know if I'm living on my reputation or what, but very seldom can I go to any kind of affair where I'm not asked for my autograph." Mickey Cohen died peacefully in his home in 1976.
Standing just a tad under 6 feet tall, with a thick head of black hair and piercing blue eyes, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel seemed to be a gangster sent from Central Casting in Hollywood. He was charming with the ladies and a sharp dresser, athletically inclined and fearless. Not only did Ben talk the talk, but he also walked the walk of a prototypical racketeer. It seemed only inevitable that Siegel would end up hobnobbing with the glitterati in Hollywood. While his friend Meyer Lansky flitted back and forth between legitimate and illegal business opportunities, all the while keeping a low profile, Siegel moved from the crime-ridden slums of Brooklyn to the backlots of Hollywood, and along the way became one of the first page-one celebrity gangsters. Bugsy was a textbook sociopath. He took what he wanted when he wanted it, and the emotion of remorse was alien to him. In his mind, other people were there to be used by him, which was demonstrated by his long record of robbery, rape, and murder dating back to his teenage years. In gangster circles, the nickname Bugsy is often a term of endearment or honor. It is given out to those racketeers who show no fear in sticky situations or who are willing to step up to jobs that others are afraid to take. Bugsy Siegel earned the nickname early on in his criminal career because of his tendency to go bugs whenever he was angered or thwarted. It was an appellation that he strongly disliked, and anyone who used the nickname to his face risked certain bodily harm. Siegel preferred that his friends call him Ben. If you weren't his friend, Mr. Siegel would do just fine. "When we were in a fight, Benny would never hesitate," Meyer Lansky once said. He was even quicker to take action than those hot-blooded Sicilians, the first to start punching and shooting. Nobody reacted faster than Benny. Benjamin Siegel, with his Hollywood friends and flamboyant lifestyle, will go down in the annals of crime history as the man who brought the rackets to the West Coast and made Las Vegas into the gambling mecca of the United States. This is the story of Bugsy Siegel, a man who rose from the depths of poverty to the pinnacle of mob life, but whose hubris would be his downfall. The Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, in the early part of the 20th century, was the proverbial melting pot of America. Within its tight confines lived thousands of Irish, Italian, and Jewish immigrants, all struggling to make a life for themselves in the New World. The streets were lined with tenements that teemed with poverty and disease. Pushcart vendors hawked their wares, yelling in Yiddish or Italian. Ethnic tensions ran high, and the streets of Hell's Kitchen were a perfect breeding ground for crime. This was the world to which Benjamin Siegelbaum was born in 1902. His poor immigrant parents raised 5 children, including Ben, on the meager wages that a day laborer could bring in. Ben saw how hard his Russian-born father worked for pennies and vowed that he would rise above this life. There would be no back-breaking garment industry job for him, he said. He was destined for bigger things. As a youngster, Ben's best friend was Moe Sedway, a diminutive lackey who was willing to go along with whatever plan Ben was hatching. Their favorite pastime was a 2-bit extortion racket launched against the street vendors. Ben would go up and ask for $1. When the vendor would tell the kids to scram, Ben would have Moe splash the wares with kerosene and set a match to it. The next time the boys came around, the vendor was usually willing to pay up. From there, Ben and Moe moved into a protection scam, taking money from the vendors on Lafayette Street in return for making sure no one else pulled the same ripoff. It was while Ben was running this protection racket that he met another immigrant teen outlaw with big plans. Together, these two youngsters would build up a gang of killers that became first the underworld's murder-for-hire squad and later an integral part of the fledgling national crime syndicate. There are several stories of how Bugsy Siegel met Meyer Lansky. The first, probably apocryphal, is that Bugsy had been enjoying the unpaid favors of a prostitute in the employ of a young Charlie Luciano, and that Lucky was none too happy about her extracurricular activities. He began to beat the hooker and Siegel after catching them in the act, and Meyer, then a tool and die apprentice, happened upon the scene. Lansky came to Siegel's rescue by beating Lucky with one of his tools, and the trio reportedly became friends. Another version of how the two met, retold in Little Man, Meyer Lansky and the Gangster Life by Robert Lacey, claims that Lansky was watching a street corner craps game when a scuffle broke out and a gun fell to the pavement. Siegel picked up the piece and was preparing to shoot the gun's owner when police whistles sounded. Lansky knocked the gun from Siegel's hand and dragged him away from the ruckus. Although Siegel was not happy about losing the gun, a friendship blossomed. Yuri Dan, an Israeli journalist who interviewed Lansky for his biography Meyer Lansky, Mogul of the Mob, also cites this story. Lansky, who had already had a run-in with a young Salvatore Lucania, later known as Lucky Luciano, saw that the Jewish boys of his Brooklyn neighborhood needed to organize in the same manner as the Italians and Irish. The first person he recruited for his gang was Ben Siegel. "I told little Benny that he could be my number two," Lansky remembered years later. "He was young but very brave. His big problem was that he was always ready to rush in first and shoot to act without thinking." Siegel's gang mates included Abner Longy Zwillman, who later ran the rackets in New Jersey, Lepke Buchalter, the head of Murder, Inc., and the only top mobster to get the chair, Lansky's brother Jake, and a young boy named Arthur Flagenheimer, who would go make a name for himself as Dutch Schultz. Benny and Meyer Lansky were so close that the gang became known as the Bugs and Meyer Mob. Doc Stacher, another member of the Bugs and Meyer mob, recalled that Siegel was fearless and saved his friends' lives many times over as the mob moved into bootlegging. "Bugsy never hesitated when danger threatened," Stacher told Yuri Dan. "While we tried to figure out what the best move was, Bugsy was already shooting. When it came to action, there was no one better. I've never known a man who had more guts." Lucky Luciano remembered a similar Ben Siegel in his biography, The Last Testament of Lucky Luciano. "We was like analyzers," he said of himself and Meyer. "We didn't hustle ourselves into a decision before we had a chance to think it out. Siegel was just the opposite, and I guess that's what made him good for us because he would make his move on sheer guts and impulse." Meyer Lansky had a knack for turning enemies into friends. His first meeting with Bugsy is evidence of that fact. Lansky, also the son of Russian immigrants, was also able to earn the respect of Charlie Luciano at an early age and served as the link between the Sicilian and Jewish mobs. Lansky's friends were fiercely loyal because Lansky was loyal to them. Even after Charlie went to prison on a narcotics charge in 1915, Lansky remained close to the Sicilian. Because of Lansky's friendship with Charlie, Bugsy was also tight with Luciano. Emerging from prison after serving 6 months of a 1-year sentence, Luciano was hot for revenge. He knew who had set him up for the drug charge, the son of an Irish cop. Luciano wanted the kid dead and was prepared to take quick action. Lansky, as always, was more thoughtful. "Don't act rashly," he told Luciano. "Let it sit for a while. This is something Ben and I can handle." By this time, the Bugs and Meyer mob was running street corner gambling games, protection rackets, and a stolen car ring. But murder wasn't something that they had tackled. Until now, Lansky and Siegel waited a full year to exact revenge. Then Lansky told Luciano to take a vacation and get out of town with a solid alibi. While Luciano established the precise and verifiable details of his alibi, Siegel and Lansky went to work. Soon afterward, there was a massive manhunt for a missing 19-year-old Irishman, the son of a Brooklyn cop. Charlie was hauled in for questioning, but his alibi held. The boy's body was never found. The killing would have repercussions for Siegel nearly a decade later. In the fallout of the killing, a local woman started to lean on the trio, saying unless they paid up, she would go to the police with information about the boy's disappearance. Lansky, Luciano, and Bugsy paid a visit to the woman's apartment and savagely beat her as a warning to keep her mouth shut. They were caught in the act by the police, who hauled them down to headquarters. The woman, who had apparently got the message they were trying to impart, failed to show up for the court date. 8 years later, Siegel ran into the woman in a bar. Mocking Ben was never a wise move, but the woman apparently wasn't that bright. She told him he had been wet behind the ears and wouldn't have known what to do with me anyway. Ben decided to show her that he had grown up and learned how to handle women. He followed her home, and as she approached an alley, Siegel pulled her into the dark and raped her. He was arrested, but Lansky had a few words with the woman and the charges were dropped. In the years following the Irish boy's disappearance, Siegel, Lansky, and Luciano kept low profiles, working mostly on floating crap games, small-time union headbusting, and robbery. The Bugs and Meyer mob was known as a stick-up and burglary operation, running gambling ventures in Brooklyn but roaming far from home in Harlem and other Manhattan areas to commit their robberies. The gang was already known for its viciousness. They weren't afraid to use knives or fists to beat up whoever got in their way. By the end of World War I, the Bugs and Meyer mob was in full swing, operating closely with Lucky Luciano and his right-hand man, Frank Costello. Although the Sicilians and the Jews were separate gangs, there was more than a loose association between the two groups, something that was unusual at the time. Both Lansky and Luciano refused to be limited by the old rules that said Italians were Italians, Jews were Jews, and never the twain shall meet. While the rest of the world was occupied with the fighting over in Europe, the Bugs and Meyer mob and Luciano's boys were busy terrorizing the people of New York. Pawnbrokers, moneylenders, and immigrant businesses were most often their shakedown or robbery targets. While Bugs remained a hothead who liked to fight first and ask questions later, Lansky and Luciano were making plans to break into the big time. Unlike other gangs who spent their swag as soon as they acquired it, Meyer and Charlie, who adopted the anglicized name because his Jewish friends had trouble pronouncing Salvatore, put aside their money in a special fund. As the war came to a close, neither man had a good idea as to what the bankroll would be used for, but they both knew that to hit the big time, they had to have capital behind them. Meyer, ever the businessman, was busy reading up on management practices and investment policies. He told Benny to case out a local bank to see if it was worth putting the funds in. Benny returned from the visit unimpressed. "I'm not putting any of my money in there," he reported. "Anyone could bust in and steal every dime in the place." 2 weeks later, the Bugs and Meyer mob returned to the bank not to make a deposit, but to hold the place up. They overpowered the aged, half-blind security guard and escaped with $8 grand. Robbery, street corner craps, and protection rackets were providing the gang with a quick infusion of funds. But Lansky, Siegel, and Luciano were smart. They realized that it was only a matter of time before their luck ran out and one of them took a fall. They began to look for different ways to tap into the huge illegal gambling market in New York. The gang began to use its bankroll to buy into established bookmaking operations and to buy the protection of the police and politicians who ran the Lower East Side. For the first time, the Bugs and Meyer mob came to the attention of the real powers in New York City, Joe the Boss Masseria and the big man himself, Arnold Rothstein. The welcomes they got from the two men were decidedly different. In early 1919, a crap game that was operating under the protection of Meyer was raided by a group of men who proceeded to beat up the game's organizers, bodyguards, and customers. The hoods told Lansky that this was a warning. Unless tribute was paid, killings would follow. Meyer and Bugs weren't ready to cave in. They hunted down the Italian who led the raid and were prepared to exact revenge when the man told them that Joe the Boss would make them pay for their insolence with their lives. They backed off and regrouped. Masseria had decided to bring the Lower East Side under his control, and the Bugs and Meyer mob was standing in the way. Masseria, an old-time gangster who was never interested in cooperation with non-Sicilians, was engaged in an effort to fill the void left by the imprisonment of the Capo di Tutti Capi, Lupo the Wolf Sayeta. He needed the money that a gambling operation in Brooklyn could provide to finance his move. Bugs, as usual, was ready to go in shooting. It didn't matter to him that Masseria had a 200-man army and that the Bugs and Meyer mob was at best a couple dozen strong. Siegel's honor was at stake, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. This time, Lansky agreed with his boyhood friend. He knew that every other mobster in the city was gunning for Joe the Boss, and that now was the time to go on the offensive. Siegel and several other toughs from his gang returned to Masseria's East Side lieutenant, and this time they didn't back down. A huge fight ensued, and the Masseria boys were routed. By the time the battle was over, the cops arrived, and Lansky, Siegel, and some other Bugs and Meyer hoods were arrested. The charge was disorderly conduct and carried a $2 fine. Misdemeanor charges aside, the fight sent a clear message to Masseria. One he took to heart. The Lower East Side belonged to the Bugs and Meyer mob. Masseria took a different tack. He approached Luciano's gang. His pig-headedness refused to allow him to work with the Jews, and lobbied hard to get Charlie to join his team. Luciano held out, negotiating for a good deal. Luciano wanted to keep his East Side rackets to himself, while Masseria wanted them under his control. Masseria also wanted Luciano to sever his ties with the Bugs and Meyer mob, something Charlie would not do. With the enactment of the Volstead Act in 1919, the manufacture and sale of alcohol became illegal in the United States. For gangsters like Bugsy Siegel, this was a license to steal. Other than speed limits on interstate highways, there have been few laws on the books in America that have been flouted with such abandon. Across the country, speakeasies, blind pigs, and bathtub gin joints sprang up with amazing frequency. Bootleggers smuggled booze across every border, in trucks, boats, and pipelines. Judges were reluctant to enforce the penalties of the Volstead Act, and police would often look the other way for a price. Prohibition did little to curb the consumption of alcohol and only served to provide the underworld with access to easy money. In New York, Arnold Rothstein knew a good thing when he saw it, and to him, prohibition was a very good thing. Rothstein, a.k.a. the Brain, was mostly a high-stakes gambler. It was Rothstein who brought floating craps down to earth and probably invented the carpet joint, an upscale casino where upper-class gamblers could enjoy a quiet game of big-money poker or blackjack, and where the patrons could rest assured that the craps games weren't fixed. Rothstein wanted to make money during Prohibition, but he wanted to do it high class. To do this, he needed partners. He turned to Charlie Luciano and the Bugs and Meyer mob. Summoned to Rothstein's Central Park residence, Meyer Lansky and Charlie Luciano were offered their chance at the big time. Over a 6-hour conversation, Rothstein laid out his plans. "There's going to be a growing demand for good whiskey in the United States," Rothstein said as the men enjoyed a pre-dinner libation. "And when I say good whiskey, that is exactly what I mean. I'm not talking about that rot-gut rubbish your Italian friends are making right now on the Lower East Side." Rothstein proposed that under the direction of the Bugs and Meyer mob, specifically Lansky, he had no patience for a man of Bugs' temperament. Dutch Schultz would take over the New York bootlegging operation, and Longy Zwillman, Lansky's close friend and kindred intellectual spirit, would run North Jersey. Other men who were later brought into the operation included the dapper Giuseppe Dotto, a.k.a. Joe Adonis, Carlo Gambino, the future head of the Gambino crime family, Vito Genovese, Gambino's predecessor as Godfather, and the sinister Albert Anastasia. As cover for their rum-running operation, Siegel and Lansky operated a car and truck rental operation through a garage on Cannon Street in Brooklyn. Ironically, Lansky's skill as a businessman made the rental business almost as much of a success as the bootlegging. While Lansky watched over the gang's ever-increasing businesses, Bugsy was the point man for the rum-running racket. Lansky was never shy about lending a hand when an extra gun was needed, but it was Siegel who craved the excitement of taking a shipment of illegal booze or hijacking another gang's property. One such hijacking took place after Bugsy got wind of a shipment coming in on the South Jersey shore. "The stuff belongs to Joe Masseria," Ben reported with glee. Lansky and Siegel, still anxious for revenge for Masseria's attempted power grab in Brooklyn, traveled down to Atlantic City and set up an ambush where they knew Masseria's boys would be coming. They felled a tree and then hid in the nearby woods, waiting for the truck convoy to approach. Thanks to a $2,000 bribe, Siegel knew exactly when and where the shipment would be coming. The shipment of top-grade Scotch whiskey was on its way from Masseria's boats to another Rothstein partner, Irving Wexler, a.k.a. Waxy Gordon. Waxy planned to mix the Scotch with some of his homemade Philadelphia rotgut and sell it at a quick profit. The raid was dangerous for several reasons. First, Masseria was still a force to be reckoned with on the East Coast. He still controlled his 200-man force and had tentacles that could reach anywhere the boys tried to hide if the raid went bad. Second, Waxy Gordon was the boss of Philadelphia and would be out for blood when his investment failed to arrive. And finally, the Bugs and Meyer gang was going against Arnold Rothstein, who was Gordon's Philadelphia's partner. Rothstein had forbidden his minions from stealing from one another, and the penalty for such insolence would probably be death. Exactly on time, the trucks rumbled up the deserted road. Seeing the tree lying across the road, the driver of the first truck halted the convoy and jumped out to move it. As soon as the group approached the tree, a fusillade of bullets rained down on them and sent them scrambling for cover. A furious gun battle ensued, and 3 of Masseria's men fell. As the battle turned in favor of Siegel and his men, they emerged from the woods and began clubbing and beating the remaining Italians who had surrendered. In the course of this savagery, one of Masseria's men recognized Meyer Lansky. Through Masseria, Waxy Gordon learned that the Bug and Meyer mob was responsible for his loss, but because he didn't want Rothstein to know he was working with Brain's despised Sicilian adversary, he kept his mouth shut. But Gordon didn't forget, and, like Masseria, who was still courting Luciano, he vowed to get revenge. About the time Lansky was meeting with Rothstein to set up the bootlegging operation, Bugsy was helping out an old friend in a jam. Alphonse Capone, a boyhood friend of Bugsy's from his days in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, was working alongside Ben as a schlemmer, a goon who, for a price, would intimidate scabs for striking labor unions, or, if the money was right, rough up union organizers as a favor for management. Capone was a member of the Bugs and Meyer mob. He worked for and idolized Johnny Torrio, the bantamweight killer who would one day help Luciano and Lepke Buchalter found the syndicate. Capone, like Siegel, wasn't afraid to kill. In a career move that foreshadowed one that Bugsy would make 2 decades later, Capone was forced to move west to avoid the law. The identity of the victim varies depending on the source, but one thing is clear: Capone was wanted for a beating that turned into murder. Before he left town, Capone went to his friend Ben Siegel and asked for help. Ben arranged for Capone to hide out with one of Siegel's aunts until things cooled down. It was clear, however, that even with friends like Bugsy, Al would have to leave New York. The heat really was on him, Lansky recalled. Al went west to join his mentor Torrio, but remained close to Siegel and Luciano. Ben's success as a bootlegger would spur on the young Scarface, who was now part of the Big Jim Colosimo gang in Chicago. Like Masseria, Colosimo was a mustache Pete who didn't like to mix with the Heebies, as he called them. Big Jim badmouthed Siegel and Luciano, and it was all Meyer could do to keep Bugsy from going to the Windy City to shut up Colosimo forever. I can't understand why Charlie Lucania, he hadn't changed his name to Luciano yet, mixes with them, Big Jim told Johnny Torrio. I sometimes have suspicions that he must have some Jewish blood in his veins. Otherwise, he wouldn't mess with that scum. Big Jim was even more short-sighted than Masseria. He felt that the old rackets of prostitution and gambling were the way to go, and forbid his gang from getting involved in rum-running. The leaders of the Bug and Meyer mob were afraid that because of Big Jim's reluctance to get into bootlegging, some other gangs would get into Chicago and lock them out. They hired Frankie Yale to go west and take care of Big Jim. Once Frankie put a bullet in Colosimo's head, Johnny Torrio took over with Al as his lieutenant. They had no reluctance to get into the alcohol business and invited Siegel and Luciano into the city. Siegel, Lansky, and Luciano made sure that they treated their friends in Chicago well. They split the profits equally between the 2 cities and built up a loyalty that would serve them well into the future. If there was one defining moment in the history of organized crime, an event that far outshone any other in terms of its importance for gangsters and racketeers, it would have to be the slaying of Joe the Boss Masseria. His death which ended the Castellamarese War between Masseria and his rival, the elderly but visionary Sal Maranzano, helped shape the face of organized crime as it exists today. Gangsters who moved up in ranks thanks to Masseria's death continued until the last decade to run the National Crime Syndicate, and the system that was put in place after Masseria's death still flourishes in the United States. By the end of the Roaring Twenties, Masseria had succeeded in convincing Charlie Luciano to join his team. Charlie continued to interact with Siegel and Lansky, but he was consumed by a war between the Masseria and Maranzano factions that was national in its scope. Both Masseria and Maranzano wanted to be capo di tutti capo, the boss of bosses. Maranzano, although he was a mustache Pete, had a plan to unite all of the Italians in New York under an umbrella group that would put an end to the hijacking, kidnapping, and murder that had gnawed away at the gangs during Prohibition. But to do so, he had to go through Joe the Boss. Masseria's philosophy was one of confrontation, not cooperation, and he had no willingness to carve up New York with anyone, least of all a backwater penny ante operator like Maranzano. For nearly 2 years, the gangs waged war on each other. The attrition was eating up both sides, but it soon became clear to Siegel and Lansky that Maranzano was willing. Sal had also been lobbying for Luciano's loyalties, and even though Lucky was working for Masseria, Maranzano still wanted his help. The men of the Bugs and Meyer mob met with Luciano and hatched a plan. Accompanied by Ben Siegel, Luciano met with Maranzano on the neutral turf of the Bronx Zoo. There, Luciano agreed to join Maranzano's gang. He would be Maranzano's lieutenant, and he would maintain his own operations with the Jewish gangsters as well as share in the Sicilian spoils. His initiation fee would be Joe Masseria's life. Luciano invited his boss to Scarpato's restaurant in Coney Island on April 15, 1931. The two men enjoyed a fine meal of the house specialties and fine Italian red wine. After more than 3 hours of feasting, the story goes, Luciano excused himself to use the bathroom. As Masseria sat at the table where he and his loyal lieutenant had been planning the eradication once and for all of the Maranzano gang, a crew of gunmen rushed in and shot him to death. Leading the charge was Benny Siegel, guns blazing. 6 bullets found Joe the Boss, who was desperately trying to find a place to hide. 14 more slugs sprayed into the wall behind him. With Joe either dead or dying, the 4 gunmen, Siegel, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and Joe Adonis, rushed from Scarpato's into the waiting car. The driver, Ciro Terranova, was so nervous that he stalled the car twice trying to get away. Siegel, awash in an adrenaline rush, slugged Ciro and pushed him out of the way. The 4 gunmen escaped before the police arrived and found the boss of bosses dead. The story of Joe Masseria's death has spawned many legends, including the one that he was found by the law clutching the ace of diamonds, the card he was going to play when Luciano returned from the bathroom. Lucky's role in the killing has also been the subject of conjecture. Sure, Luciano set up his boss, but it is unlikely that he stuck around long enough after Masseria was hit to call the police. After all, he was well known to them, had a police record as long as his arm, and would have a hard time explaining his presence. Chances are Lucky lammed before the police ever showed up. Shortly after, Lucky completed his rise to the top of the heap by killing Maranzano before Sal killed him. Dutch Schultz, a charter member of the Bugs and Meyer gang, was having his own problems. Tom Dewey, the racket-busting, ambitious special prosecutor, had trained his sights on Schultz, who was one of the dominant bootleggers and killers in the city. Schultz, although he had been a member of Siegel's gang at one time, was a loose cannon in the underworld. In many ways, he and Bugsy were alike. They were both shoot-first-ask-questions-later types and hotheads who let their guns do their talking. But Siegel had Lansky, and Meyer was always there to keep Bugs under control. Dutch had no such influence, and as a result, he was not included in the syndicate that took over after the deaths of Masseria and Maranzano. Things looked bleak for Schultz. Dewey had forced him to go underground in 1934 because of a strong tax evasion case. The syndicate contacted the man who was running Schultz's operations in his absence, another Bugs and Meyer alumnus named Bo Weinberg, who had helped form the syndicate by stabbing Sal Maranzano at Siegel's request. Weinberg was convinced to bring Schultz's business under the syndicate umbrella and given a piece of the action. After all, he was told, Dutch was on trial for tax evasion and he wasn't coming back. Bo agreed, how could he not? And the syndicate absorbed the restaurant protection racket that fueled Schultz's post-prohibition empire. But Schultz beat the tax rap thanks to a bought jury, and the Dutchman returned to New York City to find his empire gone. He was livid, to say the least. He lashed out at poor Bo Weinberg and went to see Bugsy. "Sure," Bugsy said. "I'll help you out, signing boss's death warrant." Shortly afterward, Bugsy called on his old friend Bo Weinberg and suggested that the pair go to dinner. Bugsy drove around until the two men were on a dark, deserted street. Ben pulled over to the side and got out of the car while Weinberg waited inside. Ben went around to where Bo was seated and pistol-whipped his chum. As Bo sat dazed in the car, Siegel pulled out a knife and stabbed his boyhood pal in the throat. He then began stabbing Bo in the belly to puncture his abdomen. Siegel had learned early in his killing career that intestinal gases in a decomposing body make the corpse float no matter how heavy the weights are that hold it down. One wonders what Bo must have been thinking as he endured this savage attack. After all, Ben Siegel, one of his oldest pals, was one of the group who told him to take over the Dutchman's rackets. Bo Weinberg died in Bugsy Siegel's stolen car that night and probably rests today at the bottom of the East River. After the deaths of Joe Masseria and the mysterious killing of Arnold Rothstein, Waxy Gordon decided the time had come to even the score with Siegel and Lansky. From jail, where he had been sent by the IRS thanks to information leaked from the Bugs and Meyer mob, Waxy hired the Fabrazzo brothers to take out the Brooklyn boys once and for all. The Fabrazzos and Waxy's lieutenant, Charlie Chink Sherman, broke into the Grand Street hideout of the Bugs and Meyer mob and managed to plant a bomb in a fireplace. Bugsy and Meyer were in the building when Siegel spotted the bomb and managed to throw it out a window before it exploded. The blast hurt Siegel, but Meyer was unharmed. Ben, despite his injuries, hunted down the Fabrazzo brothers and made sure that they never took on another contract. Andy Fabrazzo was found stuffed in a sack in North Jersey, and Lewis was gunned down on a Manhattan street. Tony Fabrazzo was as crooked as his brothers, but he wasn't involved in the attempt on Bugsy and Lansky. The deaths of his brothers opened his eyes to the dangers of Siegel, and Tony decided to make himself hit-proof. The lifelong mobster let it be known that he was writing his memoirs and was planning to give them to an attorney who would make sure the authorities got them if something happened to his client. One of the longest chapters of the book would be the section on the nationwide kill-for-hire squad led by Benjamin Siegel. Unfortunately for Tony, the mob got wind of his plans before he had a chance to put pen to paper. Siegel decided to take care of Tony himself. He set about creating an airtight alibi. "I'm awful sick," he told his friends in the fall of 1932. "It must be my nerves, I guess. I need some rest and quiet and a kind nurse to look after me." Bugsy checked himself into a local Catholic hospital to rest up and heal from the bombing. For 2 days or so, he rested in the hospital, just like anyone else who had been through such a traumatic experience. Then one night, he told the nurse that he was very tired and was going to be early. He asked her to close the door and make sure that he was not disturbed. As soon as the nurse left, Ben jumped out of bed, dressed and placed pillows under the sheets to make it look like a body was in the bed in case someone checked on him. He then scurried down the fire escape and met up with a couple of his gang at the corner. They drove down through Brooklyn to a house near the government reservation off Fort Hamilton Parkway. It was Tony Fabrazzo's home. Siegel knocked on the door, and Fabrazzo's elderly father answered. "We're detectives," he told the old man. "Where's Tony?" Tony was in the kitchen, undoubtedly enjoying a friendly family dinner. When his father hurried into the kitchen to deliver the message, Tony swaggered to the front door, his family behind him. Tony should have recognized the trio. He probably did, after all. He acted as a backup when Ben gunned down Vincent Mad Dog Call in a telephone booth, but when he saw them, he didn't react like a man who was a mob target. Fabrazzo presented an easy target to the killers, and they took full advantage. 3 shots rang out, and Tony, in full view of his mother and father, fell dead to the floor of his boyhood home. Bugsy returned to the hospital and was back in bed before anyone noticed anything amiss. He remained in his bed for 2 more days until he was visited by a couple of his gang members. Then he quickly packed his things and checked himself out. Later, it was learned that his mob had been watching the hospital and had noticed a couple of Fabrazzo's friends circling the block looking for a place to park. The Bugs and Meyer mobsters figured they were out for revenge and that the healthiest place for Bugsy was as far away from the hospital as possible. Fabrazzo's murder wasn't one of Ben's smartest moves. His victim knew him, and Tony's friends knew that Bugsy had been a centerpiece of Fabrazzo's tell-all book. Over time, Ben's alibi, so carefully constructed, began to crumble and he was forced underground. Other problems were also becoming apparent. Dewey was slowly turning his attention to the Bugs and Meyer mob, and it was probably just a matter of time before he got Ben on something. Things weren't completely copacetic between Lansky and Siegel either. Ben and Meyer were as close as brothers, but Bugsy wasn't happy standing in Meyer's shadow. In normal gangster behavior, when number 2 gets tired of being an underling, he conspires to bump off the boss. But even in Bugsy's twisted mind, killing Lansky wasn't something he cared to contemplate. As time went on, Bugsy became a little restless at always being second fiddle to Meyer, recalled Doc Stacher. I think that was one reason why Meyer set up the West Coast assignment specifically for Bugsy. It took about 4 years after Tony Fabrazzo was killed in his parents' home, but eventually, New York became too hot for Siegel. He would have to leave. The syndicate board of directors met and conferred about Bugsy's fate. It is a testament to the loyalty between Lansky and Siegel that the syndicate allowed Bugsy to live. Ordinarily, gangsters who become hunted as voraciously as Ben become liabilities to the mob, and they are taken out in classic mob style. Regardless of his skill and value to the mob, if Siegel hadn't been a blood brother to Lansky, he probably would have ended up on the bottom of the East River rather than the top mobster on the West Coast. Still, there would come a time when even Lansky wouldn't be able to protect Bugs, but that was almost a decade away. In the late 1930s, the western United States was almost untapped in terms of organized crime. There were gangs here and there, but the national syndicate had gotten about as far as Hot Springs, Arkansas, thanks to Oni Madden, and stopped. The strongest gang in California was headed by Jack R. Dragna, president of the Italian Protective League. The IPL was organized as a benevolent society for Italian immigrants who had come to the Gold Coast. In reality, the League was little more than a Mafia muscle outfit preying on the same immigrants it purported to protect. Dragna and his number 2, Joe Ardizzone, had their fingers in gambling, bootlegging, extortion, and smuggling, and were still active in the old-fashioned Black Hand operations that the East Coast Syndicate had abandoned in the days of Lupo the Wolf. Dragna's real name was Anthony Rizzotti, and like so many others in organized crime, he held Charlie Luciano in the highest regard. Whether that was out of respect, fear, or genuine friendship isn't known. But Luciano, uncomfortably ensconced in Dannemora State Penitentiary, serving a 30 to 50-year sentence for prostitution, sent word to Dragna that the syndicate was moving in, and he could either take part or be taken apart. Ben is coming west for the good of his health and the health of all of us, Luciano told Dragna from his cell. Dragna wisely decided to play ball. Still, Dragna resented the intrusion of the Jewish gangster from New York and bided his time looking for a chance to get rid of Bugsy. Bugsy, his wife, and their 2 daughters showed up in California and immediately rented a 35-room mansion owned by singer Lawrence Tibbett that was valued at the then astronomical price of $200,000. The white brick palace in the upscale Hollywood suburb of Holmby Hills was complete with a swimming pool and a private marble bath for Bugsy. When he got to Hollywood, Siegel looked up an old friend from Williamsburg who had made it big in the movies, George Raft, who was known for his gangster portrayals. He and Bugsy had kept in contact with one another over the years and formed such a mutual admiration society that it wasn't clear whether Raft's screen persona emulated Siegel or whether Siegel was styling himself after what Raft portrayed in the movies. Together, Raft and Siegel became regulars at Santa Anita Racetrack, wagering huge sums of money on the ponies. Raft also opened the door to Siegel's first West Coast racket. Taking a page out of the book written by Lansky and Lepke Buchalter, Siegel let Dragna handle the gambling operations while he went after the unions. His first target was the relatively easy-to-tackle Extras Union. Quickly, Bugsy and his old pal, Moe Sedway, who had followed his boss west, infiltrated the union and began extorting money from movie moguls who needed the extras to make their films. Raft also provided entree into the high-glamour world of the film stars. Starlets were taken with Ben's suave demeanor and good looks, and the men were in awe of his machismo. He quickly became the toast of the town, and no party was complete unless Bugsy Siegel was there. Siegel began a torrid romance with a wild French actress named Ketty Gallion. But Bugs was fickle, and soon he was moving from starlet to starlet, including Jean Harlow, who was sent to seek her fame and fortune in Hollywood by her childhood friend, Longy Zwillman. Once Siegel and Sedway had control of the extras union, they began to lean on the stars. At one of those Hollywood parties, Ben would approach a highly paid actor and tell him that he was putting him down for $10,000 for the extras. "What do you mean?" was probably the usual response. Bugsy would point out that the star would be unable to work on his next picture if the producer couldn't hire any extras. "What happens if the extras walk out just like that?" Siegel would say with a snap of his fingers. "You can't get more because they're all in my outfit, so no more pictures." In his first year in Hollywood, Bugsy received more than $400,000 in one-way loans from movie stars, the same people who were so desperate to have him at their parties. If Bugsy was in town, murder couldn't be far behind. While Ben cavorted with the stars, Lepke Buchalter, Bugsy's former boss in the Murder, Inc. operation, had become Tom Dewey's latest target. With Kid Twist Relis singing in the DA's office, Lepke had been forced underground and was waging a war of extermination in an effort to pare down Dewey's witness list. One of the syndicate gangsters who had lammed at the same time was Harry Schachter, a.k.a. Harry Big Greenie Greenberg. Big Greenie first headed up to Montreal but started to run low on funds. He wrote to his friends in Brooklyn and in a thinly veiled threat asked them to send him some cash. "I hope you guys aren't forgetting about me," he wrote, intimating that he had information Dewey would find useful. "You better not." In sending that letter, Big Greenie signed his own death warrant. From where he was hiding in Coney Island, Lepke, through his boss pro tempore, Mendy Weiss, ordered Harry taken care of. "We all liked Big Greenie," said Doc Stacher, but this was disloyalty and Allie Tick-Tock Tannenbaum was told to bump him off. Before Tick-Tock, the Murder, Inc. gunsel assigned to the hit, could get up to Canada, Big Greenie realized the silence that resulted after his letter probably meant he was on Lepke's list. Harry fled to Detroit, where his old friends in the Purple Gang met him. The Purples, led by Abe Bernstein, gave Harry a warm welcome. The hospitality was designed to keep Greenberg off balance until Allie could get to the Motor City from New York. But as Burton Turkis, the Brooklyn DA who would later send Lepke to the chair, said, Harry was no doorknob in the matter of brains. Greenberg saw through Bernstein's ruse and fled as far west as he could go straight into the arms of Bugsy Siegel. The long arm of Murder, Inc. reached out and tapped Bugsy, alerting him to Greenberg's presence in Los Angeles and telling him to help Allie make the hit. "It's a contract," Mendy told Ben, meaning failure wasn't an option. "But we're sending you help." "We all begged Bugsy to keep out of the shooting," Doc recalled years later. "He was too big a man by this time to become personally involved, but Bugsy wouldn't listen. He said Greenberg was a menace to all of us, and if the cops grabbed him, he could tell the whole story of our outfit back to the 1920s. Bugsy found out that Big Greenie was living at 1094 Vista Del Mar in L.A., and in tried-and-true Murder, Inc. form, he set about stalking the Lamster to determine the best way to make the hit. Bad vibes surrounded this hit from the beginning. Bugsy wasn't supposed to be involved, and Sholem didn't want to be, and the two began arguing from the start. "Steal a car and put it in the parking lot down the street from the office," Ben told the car thief. Bernstein, who had stolen nearly 100 cars for similar jobs across the country, disagreed. Usually the cars were stolen and dropped in an out-of-the-way place like a rented garage. Leaving the car in the open was a serious breach of his code, but Sholem knew better than to argue with Bugsy and did what he was told. In short order, the owner of the car reported it stolen, and the cops quickly recovered it. This time, Sholem politely suggested to Ben that a different tack be tried. True to form, Bugsy exploded. "Who the hell are you to tell me how to do a job?" he shouted. "Out here it goes my way, and don't you forget it." "The hell with him," Sholem said to himself. If Bugsy wants it done his way, he can do it himself. The freelancer got into his car and headed east. Sholom's desertion was a serious violation of syndicate ethics. Bugsy was forced to find someone else to heist a car, setting the hit back several days. Meanwhile, Carbo and Whitey reported that Big Greenie was a creature of habit and the hit could be done at any time. Each evening, Greenberg went out for a drive, picked up the paper, and returned to his apartment. On November 22nd, when he went out, the gunmen were waiting for him. As Big Greenie returned with his paper, Tick-Tock emerged from the shadows and pumped several slugs into his old friend. Harry Greenberg has the unlucky distinction of being Murder, Inc.'s first California rub-out. Of course, Siegel wasn't sent to Los Angeles just to be on call in case Murder, Inc. needed some killing done. The West Coast was a huge, untapped resource for the mob, and Siegel's primary duty was to extend a specific syndicate business to California. Bookmakers need a quick, confidential, and reliable method of reporting the winners of the thousands of horse races that they take action on. These wire services operate over a nationwide network, reporting anything that might have an impact on betting or the outcome of a race. The information they supplied included track conditions, jockey changes, scratches, post times, and, of course, results. In addition, the wire services provided bookies with up-to-the-minute betting odds, which could tip them to fixes or unusually heavy action on a particular horse. Race results on the legal Western Union wire were restricted by law. Western Union was only allowed to send the results after the race was declared official, which in many cases, a photo finish or an objection by a jockey can be delayed by several minutes. This delay allows certain unscrupulous and very gutsy bettors with inside information to take advantage of bookmakers by doing something called past posting, getting the unofficial results of the race and placing a bet before the bookmakers get the official finish. No serious bookmaker could dare operate without access to an illegal wire. At the beginning of the 1940s, two major nationwide wire services were in operation. The first, more established service was called the Continental Wire Service, operated by a Chicago gangster named James Reagan. Also operating out of the Windy City was the service that had the backing of the syndicate. Transamerica Wire was owned and operated by the Capone gang with the assistance of syndicate-backed thugs at the nation's horse tracks. One of Ben's major tasks in the pre-war 1940s was to get California bookmakers to subscribe to the Transamerica Wire and drop Reagan's service. Siegel and his helpers from Chicago concentrated on setting up Transamerica in Nevada and Arizona before moving into California, where Continental had a near monopoly. It took him nearly 6 years, but Bugsy was finally able to eliminate Continental and James Reagan at the same time through standard mob strong-arm methods. When Reagan was gunned down in Chicago cryptically, his last words were that, "Dragna is the Capone of California." Continental fell apart quickly, and Transamerica took over. Expressing its profound appreciation to Siegel, Dragna, and Jack's new lieutenant, Mickey Cohen, the syndicate back east told them it would now be handling the take from the wire services. Bugsy balked at that. He was making $25,000 a month from the wire services operations in Las Vegas alone. In no uncertain terms, Siegel told the syndicate to keep its mitts off the wire service. He would run it his way and keep the profits, thank you very much. "I'm going to run the wire here," he told his friends back east, "and it is all mine." Such defiance merited a death sentence. Even Bugsy knew that. Siegel was virtually daring the syndicate to come and get him. Benny didn't invent Las Vegas. He wasn't even the first guy to look out over the desert surrounding this two-track railroad junction town and see the possibilities for a gambling mecca. Ben merely saw a standard mob opportunity and decided to move in. Bugsy Siegel and Las Vegas are forever intertwined. Like Bonnie and Clyde or Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the story of one cannot be told without including the other. Bugsy Siegel is so synonymous with gambling in Las Vegas that many people are surprised to learn that he had a long and storied professional life before he headed west. In fact, Bugsy's work in Las Vegas came at the tail end of his career and probably went a long way in shortening his life. Modern folklore has it that Ben saw a vision out there in the desert in the days following World War II, that he kicked aside some rocks a few miles outside of town in some sort of gangland groundbreaking and decreed that here would be the Monte Carlo of the Americas, The place where high rollers and penny-ante operators alike would come to strike it rich, all the while leaving their money for the mob. In fact, Bugsy didn't see a great deal of worth in a two-bit town like Las Vegas in the days following World War II. There were a couple of dude ranches and resorts there in the desert, but Vegas was pretty much a miserable place. It was hotter than hell in the summertime, hot enough to melt the wires in a car trying to make the 2-hour trek from Los Angeles and 18 hours by plane from the East Coast. The only captive audience in Las Vegas were the soldiers from the nearby gunnery and pilot schools. But Vegas had something else going for it that no place else in the U.S. had at the time. In Nevada, it was legal to gamble. In the midst of the Depression, the Nevada legislature had adopted legalized gambling as a means to raise revenue, although most of the swank joints were up in northern Nevada near Reno. In the 1940s, the same legislature expanded Nevada's gaming laws to allow off-track betting on horse races. It was the OTB feature that first attracted Siegel, thanks in part to his interest in Trans-America Wire. Lansky and his buddies on the East Coast ran a number of carpet joints in Florida that operated on the fringe of the law, and Jack Dragna and Bugsy managed a couple of floating casinos that operated outside the 3-mile U.S. territorial limit. But setting up a permanent, lavish casino in Las Vegas would give the mob an entry into a legitimate business that was almost a license to print money. After unsuccessfully trying to buy into a couple of already established gambling joints in the city, Bugsy finally managed to scare up a partner who shared his dream of Las Vegas as a gaming paradise. Billy Wilkerson was getting ready to break ground on the most luxurious hotel Vegas had ever seen, complete with individual air conditioners, tiled bathrooms, and 2 swimming pools. Bugsy bought a controlling interest in the venture when Wilkerson's cash flow dried up. Siegel had it in mind to create an oasis in the desert where travelers from both coasts could come for sun, fun, gambling, and entertainment. He would woo travelers down from Reno with the finest hotels, food, and stars at prices anyone in America could afford. Ben called his dream the Flamingo. Sources differ as to whether this was a reference to his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, or something else. In the last testament of Lucky Luciano, Charlie remembers that Siegel once owned an interest in the racetrack at Hialeah and that he viewed the flamingos there as a good luck omen. Regardless of where the name came from, the motif of the flamingo was a garish pink with the most grandiose and lavish decorations imaginable. The flamingo was star-crossed from the start. In post-war America, construction materials were hard to come by and were very expensive. Transportation to and from Vegas was difficult, and it took all the muscle Bugsy had to smooth things out with the mob-infiltrated Teamsters Union. Bugsy was a gangster, not an architect, and some of the builders working on the project were stealing him blind. Legend has it that expensive palm trees were shipped each day from Barstow, California, only to be returned at night, then back to Vegas the next day. Bugsy wound up buying the same trees several times. Ben had convinced his fellow racketeers to pony up with a little over $1 million to build the Flamingo. Most of the money had come from the mob's earlier success with 2 smaller-scale casinos in downtown Las Vegas, but many investors had dipped into their own savings, lured by Siegel's siren song of immense wealth and quick profits. Soon, the costs spiraled upward. The $1.2 million price tag quickly became $6 million, and Lansky, Luciano, and the other investors became increasingly worried about Ben's desert dream. By December 1946, a year after the official groundbreaking, the casino had yet to produce $1 of revenue and was sucking the mob treasury dry. Not only were mobsters deep in debt, but Siegel was going back to his Hollywood friends to get more cash, telling them, "You're in on the ground floor of the biggest gold mine in the world." At a conference in Havana, Cuba, attended by Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Luciano, Vito Genovese, and Joey Adonis, Lansky revealed even more disturbing news. Ben Siegel had apparently been skimming money from the mob and putting it in numbered Swiss bank accounts. There was no doubt in Meyer's mind that Bugsy had skimmed this dough from his building budget, and he was sure that Siegel was preparing to skip as well as skim in case the roof was going to fall in on him, Luciano recalled later. Lansky was asked what the syndicate should do. The little man paused for a moment, examined his fingernails, and for a moment his mind wandered from the bright Havana sunshine and returned to the dark, dirty streets of long-ago Brooklyn. What to do about little Benny, the hot-headed boy who had saved Lansky's neck so many times, a friend who was closer to him than his own brother? Quietly, as was his manner, Lansky spoke. "There's only one thing to do with a thief who steals from his friends," Lansky said, his words coming out more like a sigh than a death sentence. "Benny's got to be hit." The syndicate chiefs put it to a vote, and with a unanimous verdict, decided to assign the contract to Charlie Fischetti. Meyer wasn't ready to give up on Bugsy yet. He stood up and recommended that the execution be stayed until after the opening of the Flamingo Casino, set for the day after Christmas. If the opening was a success, then there would be ways to make Benny pay back the money he stole. If it didn't make money, then Fischetti could fulfill the contract. Lucky agreed. Benny had been a valuable guy for a long time, almost from the beginning with me and Lansky and Costello, so none of us really wanted to see him get it, Luciano said. But if the Flamingo was a flop, well, that'd be it for him. Christmas came and went, and as he had promised, Siegel opened the Flamingo's casino for action. He pulled out all the stops, hiring George Jessel as MC and Rose Marie, George Raft, and Jimmy Durante as entertainment. Xavier Cugat's orchestra provided the music. It was a disaster. Siegel certainly was making a grand show of things, according to those in attendance. "That was the biggest whoop-de-doo I have ever seen," said Benny Binion, the downtown gambler, who stopped by to check out the competition. There were 30 or 40 big stars, people like Clark Gable, Lana Turner, Joan Crawford, Ann Jeffries, Cesar Romero, Rose Mark recalled on the 50th anniversary of the Flamingo's opening. The show was spectacular. Everything was great, but no locals came. Las Vegas was cowboy hotels. This was Monaco. The weather in Los Angeles didn't cooperate, and the two tri-tailed constellations Siegel had chartered for his Hollywood friends never made it off the ground because of fog. In Vegas, the same cold front produced a steady stream of rain that seemed to dampen everyone's spirits. With no hotel rooms, Siegel's guests gambled at his casino and took their winnings back to the Frontier or the other downtown hotels. Most of the celebrities left after the second day, leaving a vacant showroom and empty gaming tables. "We worked to 9 or 10 people a night for the rest of the 2-week engagement," Rosemarie said. "The locals just didn't come out to the Flamingo. They were used to cowboy boots, not rhinestones." Lansky reluctantly reported to his friends that the Flamingo's opening had been a flop. There was a rage among the gangsters assembled in Havana and a demand that Fischetti fulfills the contract post-haste. Again, Meyer pulled out all the stops to save his friend. He was convinced, he said, that Las Vegas could become profitable. Lansky suggested a short delay. In the meantime, the syndicate lawyers could investigate putting the original Flamingo Corporation in receivership to stop the losses. Then the mob could move in and buy out the legitimate partners with pennies on the dollar. Luciano and the syndicate heads reluctantly agreed, and Bugsy was given another reprieve. The Flamingo managed to limp through the early part of January, leaking money the way a Murder, Inc. victim drips blood before Bugsy gave up. Siegel ordered the resort closed until the hotel could be finished. Fortunately for Ben, his staunchest allies remained Meyer Lansky and Charlie Luciano, who continued to believe that money could and would be made in Las Vegas. Bugsy devoted all of his waking hours to making sure the Flamingo was ready for its grand reopening in March. Lansky had managed to buy him a few more months, and Ben made sure that he didn't waste it. He shuttled back and forth between Miami, where Meyer was living, Los Angeles, where his wife and mistress were ensconced, and Las Vegas. The casino reopened in March, even though it wasn't 100% complete. By May, it appeared that Bugsy's dream would come true, and that once again he had tempted fate and come away a winner. The resort reported a profit of over $250,000 for the first half of 1947, including the disastrous month of January. Doc Stacher and Meyer Lansky were lobbying hard on Siegel's behalf, trying to calm the nervous investors. When the Flamingo went into the black in May 1947, they were quick to point out that Bugsy was right after all. In mid-June, Ben had begun to relax. He sent a wire to his girlfriend in Paris, telling her to return to California. Virginia came back to the Golden State, but quickly she and Bugsy had one of their world-famous spats. Hill reportedly smacked a female patron of the Flamingo in the face with a bottle, and she left again, for Zurich. On the evening of June 20th, 1947, Ben Siegel was at home in the bungalow he and Virginia shared in Hollywood. He had just returned from an evening haircut and manicure and was lolling about on Hill's chintz sofa in front of an open window reading the evening papers. Gabbing with Siegel was another West Coast mobster, Alan Smiley. Upstairs, Chick Hill, Virginia's brother, was romancing his girlfriend, Jerry Mason. Things were finally looking up for Ben. His daughters were on their way out from the East Coast to spend the summer with him, and it certainly looked like the Flamingo had turned the corner. At about 10:30 p.m., a fusillade of bullets crashed through the living room window. The first shot hit Bugsy in the head, blowing his eye 15 feet from his body. 4 more bullets fired from a .36 crashed into his body, breaking his ribs and tearing up his lungs. 3 other shots missed their mark, but the damage was done. Bugsy Siegel, 42 years old, was dead. Even though Bugsy's slaying was front-page news across the country, just 5 people, all relatives, attended Ben's funeral. Meyer Lansky was in Havana and couldn't make it back in time. Virginia Hill was in Zurich, and none of Ben's Hollywood buddies managed to make it to the services. Who killed Bugsy Siegel has never really been answered, but there is no shortage of theories. Almost before the law was called to Hill's Hollywood home, 2 of Meyer Lansky's top operatives, Maurice Rosen and Gus Greenbaum, walked into the Flamingo and announced that the syndicate was taking over. Rosen and Greenbaum had worked for Lansky in his casinos in Miami, Havana, and New York, which led many to believe that Meyer had finally succumbed to mob pressure and ordered his friend killed. Yuri Dan, who had the opportunity to question Lansky extensively about Siegel's last days, reported that Meyer told him, "If it were in my power to see Benny alive, he would live as long as Methuselah." Another popular theory is that Siegel's other Las Vegas investors had him killed because his involvement was making it difficult for them to get legitimate financing. These co-investors included Greenbaum, an Arizona bookie, Willie Alderman, and Davy and Chicky Berman, guys who had run carpet joints in Minneapolis. These investors had all made a nice chunk of change with Siegel and Lansky in an earlier Vegas casino, only to reinvest it in the Flamingo and watch their cash disappear. Siegel's Las Vegas attorney Lou Weiner was one of the most vocal proponents of the Vegas partners theory. His conclusion is supported by another Lansky chum, Harold Conrad. Benny had spent a lot of their money, Conrad said, and money was what counted with those guys. The Las Vegas that Bugsy Siegel knew doesn't really exist anymore. The hotel chains and developers moved in and made offers to the mobsters that they couldn't refuse. For many years, the Flamingo flourished as one of the top hotels in Vegas, and with more than 3,500 rooms, is the 4th largest hotel in the world. But the Flamingo of Bugsy disappeared for good in the 1980s, when the current owner, Hilton Corporation, tore down the Bugsy Bungalow, a fortified cottage with 3-inch thick concrete walls. The Bugsy image was not something that was particularly endearing to the Flamingo or Hilton, said a spokesman for the hotel. This was not George Washington or Abraham Lincoln. We're talking about a robber, rapist, and murderer. Those are not endearing qualities, and that's probably the lesson that the life of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel imparts on us. A killer with a good idea is, after all, just another bum.
Maybe he said it, and maybe he didn't. But Meyer Lansky will forever be identified with the statement that the syndicate, the underworld conglomerate of hoodlums, mobsters, and killers from across the nation, was bigger than U.S. Steel. The boast made for good headlines and helped politicians like Estes Kefauver and Bobby Kennedy build their reputations and later achieved near-factual status when Hyman Roth. The Meyer Lansky-inspired character in The Godfather 2 repeated it to Michael Corleone. Whether or not Lansky ever really said it, it was probably true. Organized crime in America from the 1930s to the 1980s was big business, and Meyer Lansky had helped make it that way. There's a lot about Lansky that's apocryphal. Did he, for instance, meet Bugsy Siegel and Lucky Luciano on the same day? Probably not, but the story still floats around about how Lansky, a hard-working son of Jewish immigrants, happened along one day and found Siegel and Luciano brawling over the favors of a prostitute the Italian was pimping. Lansky, the story goes, hit Luciano over the head with a tool from his apprentice's box and stopped the fight. The known facts fit. Luciano did run some bordellos, and no one disputes that Bugsy Siegel liked the ladies. But Lansky never mentions the story in his authorized biographies, and Luciano remembers meeting Lansky when Lucky's gang tried to shake down the young Meyer and was told in no uncertain terms to go F themselves. "Okay, little man," Luciano remembers telling the diminutive Lansky, "you get your protection for free." "Shove your protection up your ass," Lansky shot back. "I don't need it." And Lansky, who had never grown much above 5 feet, proceeded to prove it to the older boy. "Believe me, I found out he didn't need it," Luciano recalled years later. Next to Benny Siegel, Meyer Lansky was the toughest guy, pound for pound, I ever knew in my whole life. And that takes an Albert Anastasia or any of them Brooklyn hoodlums or anybody anyone can think of. If there ever was a golden age of organized crime, it could be argued that it began with Lansky's descent into the underworld when he placed his first bet on a street corner craps game before the start of World War I, and ended when he died in the winter of 1983. Arnold Rothstein, the supposed fixer of the 1919 World Series, was the Cronus of American organized crime, the proto-godfather, if you will. Charlie Luciano stirred up the action, Benny Siegel provided the chutzpah, Lepke Buchalter terrorized the enemy, but Lansky rose above the fray and served as the brains of the outfit. Luciano was exiled and died relatively young. Siegel and Rothstein were assassinated, and Lepke died in Sing Sing's electric chair. But Meyer Lansky died a wealthy old man in Miami, Florida, where he was known as a supporter of Israel and a frequent contributor to the local public television station. Siegel was more likely to shoot first and ask questions later, as he lived and died by the gun. Buchalter, whose Stalin-esque purge of his own gang would signal his undoing, was the only mob kingpin to go to the electric chair. Lepke was easy to figure out. He was a cold-blooded killer who was all ego and only interested in profit. Siegel was just your basic psychopath. A nice guy one minute and a killer the next, Bugsy was a big talker and loud dresser who loved mixing it up and letting his fists do the talking. Luciano was a little more complex. Lucky killed guys, sure, but he had a sense of honor and nobility about him and seemed to recognize right and wrong, even if he ignored it. Lansky was different. He was a family man with a wife and kids and a brother. He'd learned a trade and operated legitimate businesses as well as carpet joints and bootleg operations. Lansky was one of the few mobsters who could rein in his passions, disdaining the spotlight, which attracted up-and-coming gunsels eager to make a name for themselves, as well as the law. He lived a nondescript life, a twice-married father of 3 children who preferred to let others do the dirty work for him. Meyer claimed in his biography never to have killed a man, although circumstantial evidence shows otherwise, and his exploits demonstrate that he wasn't completely averse to eliminating those who stood in his way. Where men like Lucky Luciano and Lepke Buchalter ruled their gangs through the standard mob methods of violence and fear, Lansky rose to the top of his profession because he was first a master organizer and, more importantly, a man of his word. Lansky was the brains behind the syndicate. His shrewd analytical mind was responsible for the creation of an international crime cartel, the effects of which are still with us today. This is the story of Meyer Lansky, the Russian immigrant who became known as the mogul of the mob. Legend has it that sometime in the 14th century, Jews were invited to settle in the then Lithuanian-controlled city of Grodno, a town on the border with Poland that was just beginning to make the change from a small agrarian village to a prosperous market town. The Lithuanians believed the Jews, reputed to be excellent craftsmen and tailors, could help bring commerce to the community. As in so many European cities, the Jews were tolerated when the community prospered. However, in Grodno, as in other cities, anti-Semitism was common. In the 17th century, the Russians, who had taken control of Grodno, wanted to expel all the Jews. At another time, the Eastern Orthodox priests ordered the Jews to brick up any window which faced the church. And still later, Jews were forbidden to speak Hebrew. Jewish children were sometimes kidnapped from their parents to be raised as Christians or to be ransomed by their families. Under the rule of czars, Jews in Grodno suffered greatly. There were restrictions on their business practices, and their rabbis were sometimes martyred at the hands of their Gentile neighbors. By the end of the 19th century, many Jews felt the pressure to emigrate as the Russian pogroms targeted them, their homes, and property. Among those who emigrated was Max Sokolansky, who in 1909 left his wife and 3 children behind in Grodno as he crossed the Atlantic to forge a new life in America. 2 years later, 10-year-old Meyer Sokolansky and his mother, brother, and sister followed Max to New York City. Max had saved the money to bring his family to America by working as a garment presser in the clothing manufacturing industry. On April 3, 1911, the SS Kursk landed at Ellis Island, and after numerous processing delays, the Sokolanskys were reunited in a tenement in the tough Brownsville section of Brooklyn. In the pre-World War I era, New York was teeming with immigrants from all over the world. To the 10-year-old Meyer, it was an exotic and fascinating place. I loved to walk around and see things I'd never seen before, like peaches and bananas and other exotic fruits, Lansky told Uri Dan, his biographer. I had no money to buy anything. I saw some other boys stealing, but I always remembered my mother telling me not to touch anything that did not belong to me. Shortly after moving to Brownsville, the Lansky family, the surname had been Americanized by Max shortly after he emigrated, moved to the Lower East Side of Manhattan. By no means a step up in the world, according to Lansky's biography by Robert Lacey. Meyer's mother Yetta was a dominant influence in his young life. His father was never able to overcome his depression over his abject poverty. And would only be a minor influence on his children. To please his mother was the most important thing to the young boy, and to let her down was unacceptable. For her part, Yetta Lansky was devoted to her children. She'd forego food for herself on those days when the cupboards were almost bare so that her children would not go hungry. And each week, she would scrimp and save for the Sabbath cholent, a traditional meal of potatoes and eggs, beans and vegetables. On the weeks when things were good for the Sokolansky family, there would be meat in the cholent. But more often than not, it was served as a meatless dish. Cholent is prepared before the Sabbath, for on the Sabbath, no cooking's allowed. On the Friday before the Sabbath, Meyer's mother would hand the cholent to her oldest son, and it was Meyer's job to take the dish down to the local bakery because the family didn't have an oven large enough to fit the dish. Proudly carrying the family's Sabbath dinner and a nickel to pay the baker for the privilege of using the large oven, Meyer would walk down Delancey Street past the small storefronts, pushcart vendors, and street corner craps games. On one fateful Friday, young Meyer, who had vowed that one day his family would have wealth, decided to risk the nickel on one of those street corner games. Although he'd never gambled before, Meyer had often watched in fascination as the Irish and Jewish immigrants played with what looked like a fortune to the youngster. Confident that he would win and would be able to return home with more money for his family, Meyer placed his bet. I handed the money over to the banker, sure I was going to win. And to my dismay, I lost it, he recalled years later. Nobody in the game paid any attention to me, and I stumbled away. For a long time, I couldn't go home. I felt worse than a criminal. I had let the family down. That Sabbath, there would be no cholent. It was a defining moment in the young boy's life. I was genuinely concerned at the way I'd upset my family, but what troubled me more than anything was that I'd lost that money, he said. That night before I went to bed, I swore to myself that one day I would be a winner. I would beat them all. Meyer began to watch the games more than ever, determined to learn the secret. He began to notice that other men would often stop by the crap games and collect winnings from the bankers manning the games. He also noticed that the bankers were using shills, men with whom the bankers were in cahoots, to get others to play the game. I kept my eyes wide open and soon understood the tricks, Lansky said. Then I decided it was time for me to try my luck again. This time I knew the rules and I understood exactly how they were doing it. On the Friday before Sabbath, with a cholent in one hand and a nickel tightly grasped in the other, Meyer watched a game until he saw the shill place a bet. Following the shill's lead, the young man placed his own bet just as the dice were tossed. That was one of the most fateful moments of my life. It may sound very strange when only a nickel was at stake, but it was truly a turning point. Meyer won that bet like he knew he would, and for weeks he played the same game all over the Lower East Side. Moving from street to street, staying one step ahead of the bankers and shills, Meyer never gambled with the same cholent money again. Meyer had a head for figures, and his father, a hard-working gentleman who toiled in the sweatshops of the garment industry, was determined that his son would be a success. He decided that Meyer would excel in school and would grow up to be a mechanical engineer. In deference to his mother and his paternal grandfather Benjamin, who had made it to Jerusalem, Meyer continued his religious studies and at 13 was bat mitzvah. But Meyer was living a secret life as well. Lansky was taking his education from the public schools of New York, the schools that were meant to help immigrants develop the tools to realize the American dream and to indoctrinate them into the ways of their new home, and putting it to work on the streets of the Lower East Side. Hidden in a hole in his mattress was an ever-increasing bankroll, which the young man won by playing the street corner gambling games. As Meyer continued his solitary winning, he saw that the Jews of the Lower East Side were frequent targets of the organized Irish and Italian gangs. It wasn't so much an anti-Semitic assault as it was an attack on the less organized, law-abiding immigrants. One day, walking home from school, Meyer was set upon by a group of Sicilians, boys much older than Lansky, who demanded tribute from the teenager. The leader of this shakedown group was Salvatore Luciana, who had become better known to the world as Charlie Lucky Luciano. Salvatore liked picking on solitary Jews because they rarely fought back. But this time, he realized he'd cornered a small but dangerous opponent. "Pay up," Luciana told Lansky. Drawing on his past, on the way the Jews of Grodno had stood up to their oppressors time and time again, Lansky told Luciana to go F yourself. He would not pay 1 cent to the Italian, or anyone else for that matter. Years later, Lansky would tell an Israeli writer that he never got on my knees for any Christian, something of which Lansky was very proud. Standing toe-to-toe in the dirty snow of New York, Lansky and Luciana both realized that there was something special about the other. We both had an instant understanding, Luciana remembered later. It was something that never left us. Luciana and the Sicilians let Meyer pass without paying. In 1917, Lansky left school for good, a few weeks shy of his 15th birthday. Max Lansky, determined to have his eldest son do better than himself, got his son a job as an apprentice in a tool and die operation, with the hopes that one day Meyer would be a mechanical engineer. The foreman at the tool and die shop where he started to work used to praise his dexterity. Lacey writes in Little Man, Meyer Lansky in The Gangster Life. "You have golden hands," he told the youngster. "In 20 years, you'll be a professional worker and make good money. You'll earn $1 an hour." At the time, Lansky was working 52-hour weeks for 10 cents an hour. The 20-year climb to $1 an hour was a joke to the 14-year-old who could make that in a few rolls of the dice. Meyer continued to work at the tool and die shop, but he knew he would never be a professional worker. The most important education he was getting came from his work after the shop closed, when he and an Irish friend worked as strong-arm men in a crap game run by Udi and Willie Albert. In a few short years, Lansky was known to union organizers as a shtark, a strong-armer who would do violence for a price. It's as a shtark that Lansky's name first appears on the police blotters. In 1918, 16-year-old Meyer Lansky was charged with felonious assault, only to have the charges dismissed. Shortly afterwards, Lansky was arrested again, this time for disorderly conduct. Lacey alleges that Lansky was leaning on some of the local prostitutes on Madison Street in an effort to become a pimp. He pleaded guilty to the charge and was fined $2. In 1921, a year after the Volstead Act ushered in Prohibition, Lansky quit the tool and die shop. He never worked for anyone again, Lacey writes, and he was never again employed in a conventional job. As a youngster, we were beaten up daily by the Irish boys, Lansky recalled in his later years. And we had a choice. We could run away or we could fight back, and fighting back meant everything connected with that. Standing up to the Irish and Italian gangs required Lansky and his friends to organize their own protective society. Between 1914 and 1920, Meyer and his younger brother Jake, who was everything Meyer was not, large of stature and slow of mind, were joined by Meyer Mike Wassel, Red Levine, Tabo Sandler, and Doc Stacher, who would remain a lifelong friend of Meyer's. Sometime in that 6-year period, Meyer Lansky would meet and become close friends with another man who would accompany him on his rise to the top of the syndicate. Lansky and Benny Siegel met, according to Meyer, on a street corner on the poverty-stricken Lower East Side of Manhattan when they were both young teens. The two were involved in a fight that arose from a street corner craps game when a gun was drawn and subsequently dropped. Lansky saw Benny reach for the gun and pointed at one of the combatants. Just as police whistles began to blow and the law drew near, Lansky hit Siegel's arm and forced him to drop the piece. "Are you crazy?" he shouted at Siegel. "Let's get out of here." The two youngsters ran away, although Benny could barely contain his rage at the older boy. "I needed that gun," he said. Despite the rocky beginning, Lansky and Siegel became fast friends and soon were the terrors of their neighborhood. Meyer was without a doubt the brains of the outfit, while Benny, a.k.a. Bugsy, was the brawn. Benny, the youngest member of the gang, was known on the streets as Che, the Yiddish word for untamed. He was a hothead, crazy as a bedbug, which gave him the nickname he came to loathe. Siegel was a loose cannon, and it seemed like only Meyer could handle him. It's said that opposites attract, and there are probably few friends who are as dissimilar as Lansky and Siegel. Benny was a flashy dresser who was quick to fight, and despite his high intelligence, was ruled by his passions. Meyer was the thinker, the one who never let his emotions overrule his head. Despite their differences, the two teens were closer than brothers. The Bugs and Meyer mobsters were equal opportunity thugs. They liked to shake down Jewish moneylenders and storekeepers, as well as Irish and Italian shop owners and gamblers. No one was safe from the gang. Thanks in no small part to Lansky's experience with automobiles and mechanics, the Bugs and Meyer mob were active in car theft and hijacking. The gang quickly became known as experts in transportation, with no job too big or dangerous. They fronted the operation thanks to a car and truck rental garage that served as a nice warehouse for swag. To the members of the early 20th century underworld, he was known simply as AR, or the Brain. His name was Arnold Rothstein, and in the years before Prohibition, he was arguably the most important and powerful gangster in the United States. Rothstein was a gambler and a deal-maker, and the man to see in New York City. He cavorted with killers and politicians alike, and there was probably nothing he couldn't fix, including, reportedly, the 1919 World Series. It's a testament to Rothstein's influence that in reality, he had nothing to do with the fix, but the gamblers who did used his name to impress the players involved. AR made his fortune by making deals and finding opportunities. Like a modern venture capitalist, AR bankrolled others who came to him with risky propositions. He also had the gift of being able to smell a good bet, whether it was at the gaming table or on the street, and had an eye for young hoods with potential. Rothstein was inspirational to many people, not just young gangsters like Lansky. AR provided the basis for the character of Meyer Wolfsheim in F. Scott Fitzgerald's masterpiece, The Great Gatsby, and was Damon Runyon's inspiration for Nathan Detroit and the character known simply as The Brain, who appeared in some of his plays. In early 1920, AR knew an easy way to make a lot of money. In January, the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution became law, ushering in the great American social experiment known as Prohibition. Like so many others, the Brain knew that a constitutional amendment wouldn't keep people from drinking. It would only serve to drive the drinking underground. The law of supply and demand, therefore, dictated that the price of liquor was going to go through the roof, and the Brain was determined to be in charge of supply. But AR was not the type of hoodlum who got his hands dirty. He needed partners. The Brain was looking for men who were smart enough to realize that there was still a market for high-class, expensive liquor, and who were tough enough to survive in the rough-and-tumble, dog-eat-dog world of bootlegging. Rothstein knew where to find such men. He looked to a pair of up-and-coming gangsters from Manhattan, Meyer Lansky and Charlie Luciano. Rothstein met Lansky at the bat mitzvah of the son of a mutual friend, and the Brain told Meyer he was impressed with the young man. He invited Lansky to his exclusive apartment at the Park Central Hotel, where the men had a 6-hour conversation about the future. AR wanted Lansky to go into business with him running booze. Rothstein told me quite frankly that he'd picked me because I was ambitious and hungry, Lansky recalled later, still somewhat in awe of AR. The Brain held a similar meeting with Charlie Luciano and would be a profound influence on the Sicilian. He taught me how to dress, how not to wear loud things, but to have good taste, Luciano recalled in his autobiography. He was the best etiquette teacher a guy could ever have, real smooth. Unlike other bootleggers who were interested in making a fast buck selling bathtub gin, Rothstein was intent on building a network of bootleggers who would only sell the best booze money could buy. If they know we're selling quality, he told Lansky and Luciano, they will pay for it. AR developed contacts with distilleries in Scotland who would sell him grade A scotch, which he then transferred to another minion, Irving Waxy Gordon in Philadelphia. He went to Waxy Gordon to arrange for distribution of the liquid gold, with the condition that I should have first call on the buy, Luciano wrote. Naturally, I bought every drop of it. Rothstein refused to allow his minions to cut the scotch with cheaper booze and forbade them from ripping off each other. To defy AR meant courting death. Rothstein, Lansky, Luciano, and Gordon developed a distribution system that made them all very rich men. A fifth of scotch on the boat cost the bootleggers $2.20 and easily sold on the street for 15 times that. We made what we called scotch right off the boat, Luciano said, and that original scotch would bring us as high as $1,000 a case. That case cost us, if you forget the danger part of it, only around $25. The economics of bootlegging was actually a little more complex than Luciano remembered. The supply of scotch and other whiskey had to be regular, so customs and federal agents had to be controlled. That cost money. There had to be plants to cut the whiskey in, so Lansky and Luciano went into the real estate business. They needed bottles that looked like the originals, so they bought a bottling company. They needed labels that looked exactly like the Johnny Walker, Haig & Haig, and Dewar's labels, so Lansky bought a printing operation complete with color presses. And trucks. Lots and lots of trucks. By the start of Prohibition, Lansky and Luciano, along with the Bugs and Meyer mob, were widely known in the underworld. Luciano had already attracted the attention of two of the leading gangster rivals for the title of Capo di tutti capo, boss of bosses. Both men, Giuseppe Masseria and Sal Maranzano, were not so gently pushing for Luciano to join their gangs. But Luciano was holding out because he developed a closer affinity with Meyer Lansky and was able to look past Lansky's Jewish heritage, something neither Masseria nor Maranzano, a couple of mustache Petes, could do. They wanted Luciano to dump Lansky and take over the territory the Bugs and Meyer gang had clawed out. The relationship between Luciano and Lansky was complex and very unusual for its time. Masseria and Maranzano, who headed the two most influential Italian gangs on the East Coast, refused to associate with anyone who wasn't a Sicilian. They were firm believers in the old way of doing things, the secret societies like the Black Hand, the Camorra, and the Mafia, which they brought with them from the old country. But Luciano and Lansky didn't let their different ethnic backgrounds stand in the way of friendship, partnership, and profit. As Luciano noted in his authorized biography, there was more to attract him to Lansky and Siegel than to repel him. The same ambitions, desires, and intensity transcended religious differences, wrote Martin Gorsch, Lucky's biographer. Lansky and Luciano were as tight as could be. They seemed to be on the same wavelength all the time, Siegel said. They'd just look at each other, and you'd know that a few minutes later one would say what the other was thinking, he told Doc Stacher. I never heard them argue. They were always in agreement with each other. The ethnic differences were sometimes the source of jokes between the men. Once, when Lansky, Siegel, Luciano, and Charlie's lieutenant were meeting to plan an attack on a warehouse, Lansky complained that the Jews were forced to take the risky jobs while the two Italians sat back and watched. What do you mean, two Italians? We're one Wop, one Mick, and two Jews, just like in the neighborhood, said Luciano, using the current vulgar slang for Italians and Irish. Lansky stared at Luciano like he was nuts. What are you talking about, one Wop and one Mick? Where's the Mick? Luciano started to laugh and pointed at his Italian chum, Francesco Castiglia. Him, he's Irish, you know, Frank Costello. And thus did Castiglia become Costello, a name later to be associated with the highest echelon of organized crime in New York City. The United Nations of crime grew and prospered. They bought boats for picking up loads of bootleg scotch and trucks to haul it in. Lansky and Siegel ran profitable gambling houses, and Luciano, much to the chagrin of Costello and Lansky, became an important bordello owner. The quartet and their hangers-on hit the pawnbrokers and moneylenders in the ghettos, and the insurance salesmen who collected nickel-and-dime premiums proved to be easy targets for the toughs. We had so much dough coming in that it was hard to keep track of it, Luciano said. Even a good counter like Lansky got a little confused once in a while. The group looked for ways to put their money to work for them. They bought into established bookmaking operations, the first stop in what would become a nationwide gambling syndicate. Lansky made them create what he called the Buy Money Bank, with a nest egg of $5,000, which was paid out by Costello to politicians and policemen who agreed to look the other way when the gang came into their wards. The Buy Money Bank was sort of an investment plan that paid off big for the men. Costello started small, buying the Pauls and Cops and ward healers in areas where the group was buying up bookies. The politicians, in turn, used the money to ensure election victories. By this time, the Italians and Jews of the Luciano and Bugs and Meyer mobs had attracted the attention of not only Rothstein, but of Maranzano and Masseria. As a powerful Italian, Luciano was drawn into the battle between the two old-timers despite his reservations. As a Jew, Lansky could only sit back and watch the battle and try to help his Sicilian friend. Later, once the forces of Masseria had been vanquished and Maranzano adopted the mantle of capo di tutti capo, Lansky and Siegel would step in and, working closely with Charlie Luciano, who emerged from the 2-year Castellamarese War with the appellation Lucky, would bring true organization to organized crime. In the Castellamarese War, Maranzano and Masseria attacked each other ruthlessly in an effort to unite all the Italian underworld under one boss. Joe the Boss Masseria managed to woo Charlie to his side, only to see Lucky betray him to Maranzano when the balance of power shifted in favor of Salvatore. In return for betraying Masseria and helping in his murder, Luciano was awarded with a lieutenant's position in Maranzano's new underworld order. But Lucky had no intention of staying number 2 for long. Shortly after Maranzano became boss of bosses, Bugsy Siegel and Bo Weinberg, Dutch Schultz's number 2 man, burst into Maranzano's Union Siciliano office and shot him dead. Lansky and Luciano called a summit of the major underworld leaders in New York. Taking an idea from Johnny Torrio, who gave Al Capone his start in Chicago, they proposed a loose-knit syndicate of gangs. They stressed that this was not a unification under one boss, and no one would have to surrender any power to any other boss. The syndicate, Lansky and Luciano said, would serve as a cooperative venture to halt the tit-for-tat bloodshed that had claimed so many lives in the past few years. The syndicate would become a crime cartel, Lansky said. With Maranzano out of the way, Lucky and Meyer took their show on the road and went from city to city selling the idea of the syndicate. It was clear that this was a new day for the underworld. Lucky, who because of his extroverted personality took most of the spotlight, refused to accept the sealed envelopes filled with money that was the Mafia tradition. "The old Mafia traditions are fine for Sicily," he told the mobsters. "But we're in America. The idea of putting a crown on my head is kid stuff. It's time we grew up. We'll all work for each other, but each is running his own outfit." When Prohibition ended, Meyer turned from bootlegging to gambling, which was always his first love. He never really left it, but had merely turned his attention toward the most lucrative racket at the time. When the Volstead Act was repealed, Meyer was pulling in a cool $10,000 a year, about $125,000 in 1999 dollars. But as the country went wet, Meyer's income began to dry up. He was driven back to the expertise with which he'd won his first illegal nickel, wrote Lacey. Like Charlie and Benny, Meyer had kept his crap games going throughout the bootlegging years, and the end of Prohibition brought him back to his primary virtuosity, his original love. Unlike now, in 1933, every state except Nevada made gambling, save for horse and in some cases dog racing, illegal. In New York, there was a huge underground gambling network, but it floated in almost every sense of the word. The games were held on street corners, in back rooms, and in suites of hotels. But they were rarely permanent. In many cases, the games were rigged and their operators didn't worry about their reputations for fairness, because they'd be running the game blocks away by the next day. New York turned a blind eye to illicit gaming during the August racing season in upstate Saratoga Springs. A spa community known for its sulfur springs, as well as its racetrack and casino, Saratoga was a summer camp for hot Manhattanites roasting in the city 190 miles south. The racetrack opened during the Civil War, and after the war, Southern horse owners migrated north during the steamy summer months and brought with them the gambling games from their Mississippi riverboats. By the 1890s, the casinos of Saratoga in their month of summer glory rivaled those of Europe's most glamorous spas, Lacey writes. Saratoga's two principal hotels in the main street, the Grand Union and the United States, were the two largest hotels in the world. Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, centered the novel Diamonds Are Forever around the spas and racetrack of Saratoga Springs, a town he was not particularly enamored of. In the book, Fleming calls Saratoga a stinking town, but then all gambling towns are, and points out how the city was permeated with the mob influence. By the time Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano were in a position to have an effect on the market in Saratoga, AR was in charge of the spa town. He paid off the local officials and imported his dealers from New York, but he still operated in his traditional manner by having others do the real dirty work. Lansky and Luciano were brought in to fix things with the local Pauls, as well as to run the dining room and entertainment. It was through Rothstein's patronage that Meyer, Siegel, Luciano, and Costello honed the craft of casino and hotel operations. Lansky and his chums approached casino operations with the same scruples as they had in bootlegging. They knew the percentages were in their favor and that the short-term gains from running a crooked game could never match the almost unimaginable profits from a fair casino. Everyone who came into my casino knew that if he lost his money, it wouldn't be because he was cheated, Meyer said proudly. The little man recruited the best dealers and croupiers he could find and paid them a salary plus a commission, a percentage of the drop on their tables every night. This instilled loyalty and made the dealers pay closer attention to the gamers and to each other. In the years leading up to World War II, Lansky had slowly but surely developed a reputation that attracted the highest rollers and most influential gamblers. He was partners with Frank Costello and Joe Adonis in the Piping Rock, a Moorish-style building that exuded elegance. Uniformed valets parked the cars for gamblers, and Costello had imported his chef and maitre d' from his Manhattan club, the Copacabana. Having cut his teeth on the Saratoga Springs Casino, Lansky began to branch out. In New Orleans for the 1932 Democratic National Convention, Meyer and his friend Doc Stacher met with Louisiana Governor Huey Kingfish Long and arranged for the governor to open a Swiss bank account so that he could accept $3 to $4 million in cash annually that the mobsters were preparing to pay for the privilege of running casinos in the Big Easy. Deeply impressed by this sophistication, the governor gave his visitors from New York carte blanche, wrote Yuri Dan. The opening of the famous Blue Room at the Roosevelt Hotel and of the Beverly Country Club, also in New Orleans, was the beginning of the nationwide development of casinos. Leaving New Orleans, Lansky went north to Hot Springs, Arkansas, where he worked a similar deal and put Oni Killer Madden, former operator of the Cotton Club in Harlem, in charge. The Hot Springs setup was so luxurious and safe that it became known as a place for gangsters on the lam to hole up until the heat blew over. Lucky Luciano was extradited from Madden's Spa when he was indicted by New York State Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey. Exercising considerable political muscle, Lansky proceeded to expand his gaming empire into Kentucky and eventually Florida. In Florida, carpet joints, as the illegal casinos were known, breathed life into the depressed South Beach communities of Hollywood, Hollandale, and Opa-locka. Just across the county line from Miami, some small-town casinos and bingo houses provided Lansky with the perfect setup for a South Florida empire. The good people of Broward County were not necessarily ambivalent toward the carpet joints that people like Meyer, Lansky, Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo, and Potatoes Kaufman were putting up on the outskirts of town. More than once, some high-minded citizens would approach a judge for an injunction against a particular piece of property, which would prevent the gamblers from operating on that site. The carpet joint owners would have to find another place to operate from, which created significant logistic problems for Lansky. So, Meyer sent his brother Jake down to Broward County with a sack of cash. During the months preceding the reopening of a Lansky casino, his operations manager, Brother Jake, supervised the handouts. To the Benevolent and Protective Order of the Elks, to the Fort Lauderdale Shrine Club, and to the Hollywood Fishing Tournament, to the South Florida Children's Hospital, more than 24 local organizations began receiving generous and helpful donations from the new owners of the bingo parlor near the crossroads on US 1, wrote Lacey. The ploy worked, and there were no more complaints from citizens. With carpet joints running from Saratoga to Key West, Lansky attracted the attention of many different government officials. Some were on his payroll, others were his sworn enemies. But probably the most powerful government official to be drawn to Lansky wasn't even American. He was Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista, the former army stenographer who had twice grabbed power in the Caribbean nation 90 miles south of Miami. In 1952, when Batista seized power, Cuba was known as the Paris of the New World. Europeans and Americans flocked to the sunny beaches and danced to the hot rumba rhythms of the Cuban big bands, drinking daiquiris and rums and smoking cigars. Gambling was big in Cuba, too. But Batista had a problem. The games, it seems, were seen as crooked and no one was playing. Tourism started to falter as gamblers bypassed the Cuban casinos in favor of the more honest Puerto Rican joints. Things began to look bad for the dictator. Batista needed to inject some honesty into his games quickly, and he turned to Meyer Lansky. President Batista appointed Lansky his advisor on gambling reform and gave him the authority to clean up the crooked gaming houses like the Sans Souci and the Montmartre Club. Fulgencio Batista saw the enhancement of revenues from foreign visitors, and from Americans in particular, as a major source of future income for Cuba, And for himself, Lansky wrote. Lansky went to Havana and immediately began to roust the crooked casino bosses. He kept Santo Traficante Jr., the son of Tampa's chief racketeer, but leaned on sans souci operator Norman Rothman to start running a clean game. He ordered dealers and croupiers, most of them American, who were crooked, to be deported and started the practice of dealing blackjack with a six-deck shoe, which not only helped the house in terms of percentage, but minimized cheating by the dealer and player. While Meyer's reformed Montmartre Club was a place in Havana, he had long expressed an interest in putting a casino in the elegant Hotel Nacional, which overlooked El Morro, the ancient fortress guarding Havana Harbor. Meyer planned to take a wing of the 10-story hotel and create luxury suites for high-stakes players. Batista endorsed Lansky's idea over the objections of American expatriates like Ernest Hemingway, and the elegant hotel opened for business in 1955 with a show by Eartha Kitt. The casino was an immediate success. That spring, Lansky began working on his own casino, a 21-story, 440 skyscraper called the Riviera. When it opened, it would be the largest casino hotel in the world outside Las Vegas. The Riviera was Lansky's second attempt at building a hotel from scratch. The first was the ill-fated Flamingo Hotel in Vegas with his friend and partner Benny Siegel. In the mid-40s, things were pretty hot for Benny Siegel in New York. He was the key suspect in a murder, and Meyer Lansky was having a hard time keeping him under control. The two were still as close as ever, but Benny was chafing under Meyer's leadership. Bugsy needed to go out on his own, Meyer decided, and so Benny headed west to Los Angeles to bring the operations in California under the syndicate's control. Benny quickly rose to the top out west and began to expand the syndicate inland. He looked east to Nevada and saw a small town at the southern tip called Las Vegas. Siegel wasn't the first man to build a casino there, but he was the first mobster with syndicate connections to realize that putting a casino in Las Vegas could mean a license to print money for the mob. In the years since Benny moved out west to cavort with starlets and take over the Hollywood Extras Union, he and Meyer had remained close. Armed with mob money, Siegel tried in 1943 to buy his way into a partnership with the owners of the Last Frontier in Vegas, which was then the hotspot in town. The owners went public with Siegel's action and rejected him. Instead, Siegel and Lansky acquired El Cortez, a downtown hotel and casino that had been open for several years, serving both local clientele and soldiers from the nearby Army Air Base and Gunnery School. Meyer did not share Siegel's enthusiasm for Las Vegas, telling his friend the city was in sorry shape and concentrating on his carpet joints in Florida. He put up a $60,000 investment in El Cortez and became a silent partner, letting Siegel run the show. Soon after the men bought the casino, Siegel sold the operation and netted a $166,000 profit, a 27% return on their investment in just 6 months. In 1946, with the Las Vegas real estate market booming, Benny convinced the investors in El Cortez to reinvest in a bigger, larger, more fabulous new casino he was going to build. The Flamingo, named for his girlfriend Virginia Hill, would be a glitzy alternative to the Dude Ranch-style hotels like El Cortez and the Last Frontier. Lansky allowed Siegel to reinvest the $650,000 from the sale of El Cortez into the Flamingo, buying a 66% stake in the casino. As controller of the majority consortium, Benny set himself Christmas 1946 as his deadline for getting the Flamingo finished, Lansky wrote. But he immediately developed bright new ideas for improving the rooms. The charming and imperious Ben Siegel totally lacked his friend Meyer's sense of control. There were incredible cost overruns and delays caused in part by Siegel's ignorance of how to build a hotel of the magnitude of the Flamingo, and partly because of the booming post-war construction industry. In Havana, where Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, and the rest of the heads of the syndicate were meeting in secret because of Luciano's exile, Lansky was forced to tell the bosses that the cost of the casino would far exceed the $1 million they'd been told. In fact, Meyer admitted, the Flamingo was likely to cost the syndicate about $6 million before it would be completed. Immediately, there were calls for Siegel's head, but Lansky was able to pacify them with promises of huge inflows of cash once the buildings were completed. What was unsaid at the meeting in Havana was that some mobsters were getting suspicious of the frequent trips Hill was making to Geneva, Switzerland, reportedly on buying trips. The gangsters believed Hill and Siegel were skimming investment money and secreting it away in a numbered Swiss bank account. This sort of behavior meant only one thing in the underworld, Doc Stacher said. Bugsy was going to be a hit. Meyer knew it too, but he did all he could to save his friend. Meyer talked the men into giving Bugsy until the spring to turn a profit, and then went to Las Vegas to try and talk some sense into his old friend. Benny had turned decorating control over to Virginia Hill, who was in many ways responsible for the overruns. When Meyer returned from Las Vegas, he was quite dejected. "I can't do a thing with him," Lansky told Stacher. "He's so much in that woman's power that he can't see reason." Luciano told Lansky that Bugsy would have to get things under control, or he'd order their old friend killed. "Unless Bugsy makes a great success of that hotel, you know as well as I do that he'll have to be hit," Luciano told his friend. "And if you don't have the heart to do it, Meyer, then I'll have to order the execution myself." Doc Stacher reported that Luciano's comments brought tears to Meyer's eyes, and he excused himself from the meeting with bosses. For 2 hours he remained in his suite at the Hotel Nacional before calling friends in the States and ordering them to keep an eye on Benny. "If anything happens to him," he told Benny's lieutenant, "you will answer to me." Siegel managed to get the casino completed by his self-imposed December 1946 deadline, but not the hotel portion. On December 26th, the casino opened with Xavier Cugat's orchestra providing the music and Jimmy Durante and Rose Marie providing the comedic entertainment. At the gambling tables, nothing went right for the mobsters. Although in the long run, the house can't help but win because of the way the games are structured, in the short run, the guests at the Flamingo cleaned the casino out of $75,000 in the opening evening. Siegel managed to struggle on for 2 weeks before realizing that the casino would have to close when the hotel was being finished. Back in Cuba, Lansky once again saved Benny's life by coming up with a plan to put the Flamingo in receivership and setting up a new syndicate to buy out the old corporation. Luciano backed Lansky's plan, despite reservations by a number of other bosses. In March, the Flamingo reopened, and by April it was starting to get out of the red. In May, the casino turned a profit, but for some reason, it was too late to save Benny. In mid-June 1947, sitting in his apartment in Beverly Hills, Benny Siegel was gunned down by an unknown killer. Shortly after Siegel died in California, 2 men working for Meyer Lansky walked into the Flamingo and announced that they were taking over. Maurice Rosen and Gus Greenbaum had worked for Lansky in Miami, Havana, and New York, which gave a great deal of strength to the theory that, in the end, Lansky had ordered his best friend killed. Lansky, however, denied having anything to do with Benny's killing. "Ben Siegel was my friend until his dying day," he told Uri Dan. "I never quarreled with him. If it was in my power to see Benny alive," he added, "he would live as long as Methuselah." Meyer Lansky's religious upbringing and cultural background as a Jew played conflicting roles in his lifetime. He was never particularly religious after leaving his parents' home. Neither of his sons was bat mitzvahed, and after the death of Lansky's father, he chose not to continue the Hebrew tradition of honoring the father on the anniversary of his death. Whether that was because of Lansky's disdain for his weak father, or because he turned his back on his faith, is really unknown. "He was never Jewish-minded when we were growing up," said his son Buddy. "The Christmas tree, the bacon, no bat mitzvah. We didn't know what Jewish was." As time went on and Lansky grew older, his Jewish heritage came to mean more and more to him. He visited Israel for the first time when he was almost 60 years old, and the visit to the Holy Lands reignited a passion for his culture. In 1970, hounded by the police, wiretapped by the FBI, and under surveillance at every turn, Meyer Lansky decided to join his friend Doc Stacher in Israel. After living in Israel for several months, Lansky decided to take advantage of the country's unique immigration law, the Law of Return, which states that every Jew in the world is eligible to become an Israeli citizen. Every Jew, save for those with a criminal past likely to endanger the public welfare. Lansky engaged several attorneys in order to secure his rightful place as an Israeli citizen. "I have no criminal past which is likely to cause a breach of the peace, and I'm not now likely to endanger the peace of any country," Lansky wrote to the Ministry of Interior. Things looked favorable for Lansky and his second wife Teddy until the Israeli press caught wind that Meyer Lansky, the chairman of the mob board of directors, was in Tel Aviv. Photographers stalked the Lanskys, and newspapers reported that he was planning on continuing his racketeering in Israel. It wouldn't have been hard to do, but Lansky was fairly close to being retired by this time. In the end, when Israel's Prime Minister Golda Meir found out Lansky was connected to the Mafia, she intervened in the naturalization process, and Lansky was turned out of the country. From Israel, Lansky traveled to Zurich and quickly left Switzerland for South America. He was trying to stay one step ahead of the FBI, which wanted to arrest him on racketeering charges, but Paraguay would not accept him either, and he was placed on an airplane whose final destination was Panama City, Florida. There would be no escape for Lansky this time. Immediately after the plane touched down in Florida, FBI agents arrested Lansky, and he was held until he posted a $250,000 bail. From jail, Lansky checked into the Mount Sinai Hospital for observation. The stress of the 13,000-mile journey from Tel Aviv to South America through Latin America to Florida had taken its toll on the heart of the 70-year-old Lansky. In the federal court in Miami, Meyer Lansky, proclaimed by the Miami Herald as the Gangland Finance Chairman, was convicted of contempt of court for failing to return from Israel 2 years earlier to answer a grand jury's questions. He was sentenced to a year and a day in jail. Soon afterward, with his contempt conviction on appeal, Lansky was tried for tax evasion, despite his ill health and need for oxygen and almost constant medical attention. The jury in this case took little time in finding against the government and for Lansky. Meanwhile, the Fifth Circuit Court overturned his contempt conviction. Finally, the third case, which had precipitated Lansky's deportation from Israel, was dropped by the government after an unfavorable ruling by the judge. "He was able to go to his grave laughing that he whipped us all," said one FBI agent. Lansky lived an additional 6 years after his final court battles. In that time, he never gave up hope of returning to Israel, either as a tourist or as a citizen. But his health became poor, and on January 15, 1993, Meyer Lansky, the mastermind of the mob, died at his home. He would have been chairman of the board of General Motors if he'd gone into legitimate business, an agent of the FBI once said of Meyer Lansky with grudging admiration, wrote the New York Times in his obituary. And in a moment of triumph, Mr. Lansky once boasted to an underworld associate, "We're bigger than U.S. Steel." Superlatives and apocryphal statements filled the little man's obituaries. He was called treasurer of the mob, frequent advisor to the Chicago mob, and the most influential godfather in the history of American organized crime. In all the hyperbole on a poor weekend for news, only the Miami Herald pointed out that Lansky's reputation was a matter of popular belief, never proven legally, and that Lansky's links to mob killings were more by speculation than by proof, Lacey wrote. Bugsy Siegel once told a non-mobster that people had nothing to fear from men like himself and Lansky. "You see," he said, "we only kill each other." But even though Meyer Lansky was never convicted of murder, shunned criminal enterprises like narcotics and prostitution, and gave people the illicit things they really wanted, like alcohol and gambling, he shouldn't be dismissed as just an interesting underworld figure. Every time an honest citizen buys clothes, they're paying for protection from the garment industry racketeers. And in many cities, particularly large ones, garbage collection includes the hidden cost of mob tribute. Payoffs made to crooked politicians help them remain in office and contribute to the malaise that Americans feel about our political system. Meyer Lansky didn't invent graft, and he didn't install the protection rackets in the unions and garment industry. But it was through his guidance that the syndicate was able to prosper in the United States. He might not have been the one to suggest the idea that the mob get involved in narcotics, but his system of cooperation between various gangsters, regardless of race or ethnic background, paved the way for today's organized gangs. He prided himself on his honesty and his commitment to working a fair deal, but his vision has been perverted by others with fewer scruples. If Meyer Lansky has left a legacy, it's in the widespread corruption which pervades our society. In the final analysis, Meyer Lansky was a criminal. He could have devoted himself to building an honest career where a man with his talents could have gone far. Maybe anti-Semitism held him back. Maybe not. But the fact that he chose to be a criminal rather than a law-abiding lifestyle means any admiration we feel for Meyer Lansky should be mixed with contempt.
On a cold, blustery morning, January 18, 1983, a businessman called the police once again to report a maroon Cadillac that had been left in the parking lot of the Varnus Boat Club in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, New York. It had been there for over a week. Clearly, it was abandoned. The police had already been there once, and upon determining that the car had not been reported stolen, had left it where it was. They assumed that the owner would eventually come to collect it. Yet no one came, so the club manager asked police to have another look. They decided to investigate more fully. By now, they were aware of a missing person report on a man from the area, filed by his wife, and this car fit the description of the one they were seeking. The car appeared to be empty, although there were dark stains on the seats. One officer jumped up and down on the rear bumper, and from the way the car rocked, he decided that the trunk was empty, so they towed it to a police garage. Forensic analysts allowed the car to warm up inside for 2 hours before starting their examination. Then they popped the trunk and found something they didn't expect, a chandelier. But there was something else. Beneath the chandelier was the dead body of a heavy-set, dark-haired man, 40-ish, who appeared to have been shot several times. His body had frozen into rigor mortis, and the cold January temperatures had kept it rigidly in place, with one hand defensively over the face. His black leather jacket was wrapped around his head like a turban, and his torso was frozen to the spare tire. A bullet hole went right through his now solid hand, and an examination later indicated an execution-style killing, with a bullet hole behind each ear. In all, the man had been shot 7 times, and he lay in a pool of frozen blood. According to his son, who later claimed the car, papers from the gloves used by crime scene technicians were dumped into the blood, as if the criminalists had used the once fine car as a trash can. In the back seat was a wire that apparently had been attached to a recorder, but the recorder was gone. There was also a New York magazine, according to reporters Gene Mustaine and Jerry Capici in Murder Machine, which featured a cover story on dealing drugs. There was little doubt in anyone's mind that this killing had been a professional hit and that the body was meant to be discovered. It was unlikely the killer or killers would ever be found. Yet, in many ways, the victim had done himself in, a common fate for those who run with the wrong crowd. This man had left home on January 10th, around 9:30 in the morning, saying he had an appointment that afternoon to go over some legal papers. His daughter's birthday party was scheduled for that evening, and he assured his wife he would be there. He was always around for birthdays. But he never returned this time. The family filed the missing person report that led to the opening of the car, but it was 8 days before they learned that he had been executed and left locked in the trunk of his car. His 17-year-old son cried in disbelief, but the man's wife did not. She had him buried in St. John's Cemetery on Long Island. It was years before the real story came out, offered from 2 perspectives: the son who knew that his father was in trouble and someone who knew the gang that had killed him. Currently, there are 2 primary sources for information about Roy DeMeo: Murder Machine and Albert DeMeo's For the Sins of My Father. Each offers a significantly different perspective on the man reputed to be the Mafia's most cold-blooded killer, responsible for orchestrating possibly as many as 200 executions. How does someone go from such a powerful and feared position in one of New York's prominent crime families to sharing the bloody trunk of his car with a broken chandelier? Roy Albert DeMeo was born in 1942 into a working-class Italian family in Brooklyn, New York. Like most teenagers in the 1950s, especially those in economically deprived circumstances, he looked for ways to make money. From hanging out with the sons of a neighbor, Mafia boss Joseph Profaci, Roy learned about the illegal practice of loan sharking. Someone with means loaned money to people who could not get loans from regular venues, such as banks, and for this favor, they would then charge exorbitant interest rates. At first, Roy's assignments were just to pick up the interest owed each week from various businesses, but eventually, he learned how to make the loans on his own. Through that enterprise, he was drawn more deeply into organized crime and was exposed to the ways of the Southern Italians who had transplanted to New York. Southern Italian men, as detailed in Howard Abedinsky's Organized Crime, had long developed certain ideals that fueled ambition in an arena where they were otherwise powerless. According to their code, a real man did not cooperate with authorities, maintained self-control in the face of adversity, carried out vendettas to avenge any slight suffered by his family, and did not forget. According to this ideal, the family connection was the only basis for trust, and that included even the most remote blood relatives. Outsiders could become family through rituals that involved the tradition of godparenting. The patriarch decided all of the important matters in the family, including who would live and who would die, as well as the enterprises in which the clan made money. Carlo Gambino and Paul Castellano, for example, forbade drug dealing among family members, especially heroin, because the stiff penalties could easily turn dealers into government informants. Those who participated in this illegal and forbidden venue risked being made a memory. Everyone, writes author Richard Gambino in Blood of My Blood, was responsible to the capo di famiglia. The duty of family members was to make the family, especially the patriarch, wealthy, respectable, and powerful. That meant good marriages and honorable alliances with other families of statuses, mostly Sicilians with Sicilians. Those who were strong and aggressive on the family's behalf were rewarded with more responsible roles. To prevent anarchy and the avenging of imagined slights, rules were devised to keep order. Hence, even as criminals exploiting society at large, if they respected the rules, they could consider themselves men of honor, a concept associated with domination, manhood, and strength. When several families were allied, or at least in agreement, one man stood out as the boss of all bosses, the capo di tutti capi. The others owed him their support and respect. He offered protection in the form of employment, lawyers when arrested, expenses for the family when serving time, and threats against business rivals. For these services, he took a cut from everyone's pie. All business was transacted through him, and he settled grievances among family members. Nicholas Pileggi says that the attitude developed among wise guys, or members of traditional families dealing in organized crime, that crime was preferred over legitimate business because much more money could be made. In Wise Guy, Life in a Mafia Family, he states, they lived in an environment awash in crime, and those who did not partake were simply viewed as prey. To live otherwise was foolish. Easy money, especially made by getting one over on someone else, was the best money. Apprenticeships often occurred within the neighborhood gang. You came into contact with it, you got assignments, and you proved yourself. As an adolescent, Roy DeMeo might just as easily have learned some other trade. His mother hoped he would become a doctor, but loan sharking proved to be easy money, made quickly, and he was good at it, partly because he had no qualms about using violence against someone who failed to pay on time. He saw nothing wrong with the practice. Strongly impressed with the shiny Cadillacs that the neighborhood gangsters drove while he was growing up, he made his choice. It wasn't long before he met members of the Gambino crime family. Carlo Gambino commanded some 250 made men and hundreds of other associates, who collectively controlled a virtual crime empire in the New York area. Roy wanted in, so he proved himself as a soldier under the command of Anthony Gaggi, known as Nino. The more money he turned over to Nino from his own take, the more Nino could pass on to his overbosses. Nino had influence, and Roy had the ability to earn, so they used each other. Nino Gaggi had grown up in the dog-eat-dog world of Manhattan's Lower East Side, learning fast about the survival of the fittest among the racketeers who made up the crime families. Those who were powerful got the spoils, and they displayed their power in material wealth, fine clothing, and a polished appearance. Beneath tailored suits, silk ties, and manicured nails, they were willing to do whatever it took to develop, hold, and improve their position in the family. At 5'8" and 160 pounds, Nino had been a fighter, and he'd quickly sniffed out the opportunity for himself in the form of his father's cousin, Frank Scalise. A loan shark with connections in high places, Scalise was an underboss for Albert Anastasia, and Nino ran a stolen car ring for him. In 1957, Frank Scalise was hit while out buying fruit, allegedly because he was selling memberships into the family to enrich himself. Then, 2 more soldiers from the same family were assassinated, including his brother, which provoked a war in the underworld. By the end of that year, Anastasia was murdered, which meant someone could take over the reins. Carlo Gambino and his cousin and trusted underboss, Paul Castellano, rose to the top of the heap, and Nino, having proven himself on the lesser rungs of the ladder, now became a made man. To become a made man in a crime family, one had to demonstrate 2 abilities on a continuous basis. One was to make money. As one character on the Mafia television series The Sopranos told another, "You're only as good as your last envelope." To prove one's manhood meant lining the pockets of the bosses, as well as one's own. The other qualification was to kill when necessary. Family members had to be trustworthy, which meant they kept quiet about the family's clandestine operations. If they didn't, they were dead. However, people could be whacked or eliminated based on mere suspicion and innuendo. So if someone wanted to usurp another's business operations, he had only to spread the rumor that the target man was either an informant or talking subversive, as in threatening to undermine the boss. People got whacked for lesser crimes. But Roy's were not insignificant. Roy was 32, living in a nice home in an exclusive community with his wife and children when he committed his first murder for the family. He was running an extortion scheme with Nino against a lucrative X-rated film business, and when the owner and his partner were raided and arrested, it appeared that one of them, Paul Rothenberg, might offer up his association with Roy and Nino in a deal. Roy scheduled a meeting with him at a diner, ostensibly to assist with legal expenses. When they got out of their cars, Roy pulled a silencer-equipped gun, took the businessman into an alley, and executed him with several bullets to the head. Used to being a bully as a teenager, he had no problem threatening people. Now that he had killed, it was just business as usual to him. In fact, it empowered him. Once you've killed someone, he was later to impress upon his apprentices, you can do anything. Thereafter, he began to train a crew of young men to become killers on demand and to get rid of a body quickly and efficiently. Roy had once been a butcher's apprentice, so he understood how to cut limbs from bodies. Among DeMeo's initial recruits was a 16-year-old Jewish kid named Chris Rosenberg, who despised his ethnicity and desperately hoped he could one day prove himself to the extent that the Italians would welcome him as one of their own. Roy met Chris in the Brooklyn-based neighborhood of Canarsie, where Chris was dealing pot, and helped him move into a larger money-making arena. He got Chris and his friends into the business of stealing cars that could be turned into saleable items for wealthy clients overseas. A car mechanic named Freddie Dinome joined them. Then 2 more came aboard, high school dropouts Joey Testa and Anthony Center. Roy bought an owner's interest in Phil's Lounge, a bar in the front of a 2-story building from which he had run his illegal operations, and one of his cohorts renamed it the Gemini Lounge. Joey and Anthony were soon dubbed the Gemini Twins. A 5th young man with a killer's cold heart, Henry Borelli, came onto the team, and they would all meet at this bar to socialize, organize their illegal business operations, and perform more clandestine tasks. Roy began collecting weapons as he kept his impressive arsenal of machine guns, automatic rifles, and silencers in a room at the lounge. He also installed his cousin, whose nickname was Dracula, into the adjoining apartment. Because he could stomach it, Roy devised a specific form of getting rid of someone, which eventually came to be known as the Gemini method. He trained his crew how to participate in a disassembly line. If someone needed to be made a memory, disposal was always a problem, so his method appeared to be an answer. Mustaine and Capici, recording what they had learned from the confessions of Nino Gaggi's nephew, Dominic Montiglio, present the method in detail in Murder Machine. The target person, whom someone higher up had ordered eliminated, would be invited into DeMeo's Gemini Lounge, or, in one case, the meat department at a supermarket. He'd be shot at once by one crew member, often Roy himself, wrapped in a towel by another to prevent blood from messing the place up, beheaded, and hacked into pieces. The various parts were then packaged in plastic garbage bags like meat and tossed into a dump. Just like taking apart a deer, DeMeo told his gang, there was no real difference. While they did execute a few females, there's no record of female dismemberment. However, this manner of disposal had to be refined. The first time they tried it, on a criminal card dealer who turned informant in 1975, they were careless. First, Chris, Joey, and Anthony used a pretty girl to lure Andre Katz, so she was a witness. Next, they hauled him off the streets publicly, leaving his car open and empty, clearly a missing person. Then they took him to a supermarket where they met Roy. Then he told them the plan, and they had to go along with it or walk. It was the moment of truth for all of them. Could they deal with hacking a human being apart? On this night of the knives, as Mustaine and Capici call it, Chris used a butcher knife to still the man's heart by piercing it clean through several times. The crew donned butcher's aprons to proceed, and the others wrapped the body parts in green bags. Then they dumped these packages into a garbage bin to be hauled away. However, the team had miscalculated when the garbage collection would occur, giving a foraging homeless man ample time to pull open the packages and expose the human body parts. He ran, but another man coming along saw what it was and called the police. In all, they found 8 neatly wrapped packages, but never did find the genitals. The coroner who examined the mess and eventually identified the remains was Roy's second cousin. The girl who had innocently lured the doomed victim read about his death in the papers and turned on the crew. The police arrested 2 of them, but no evidence connected them to Roy. He got them a lawyer, but they had to serve some time. When their trial came, their lawyer undermined the girl's credibility and the 2 crew members were acquitted. To Roy's relief, nothing came of the incident that compromised him, and thereafter, with the exception of a victim they hastily left half decapitated in a motel room, the crew took on the added chore of taking the parts themselves to the dump. A few were buried beneath ongoing construction, and one was sealed into a barrel into which concrete was poured, but it appeared that the standard disposal was the local garbage dump. Such disappearances happened frequently and systematically. By some estimates, in less than a decade, there were between 75 and 200. The 5 men involved in the disassembly line said to associates that they got a kick out of it. According to Mustaine and Capici, they used to say killing made them feel like God. In 1976, when DeMeo was 34 and had been training his killing crew for over a year, Carlo Gambino died. Inevitably, power shifted and the new godfather was now Big Paul Castellano. This was one more good thing for Roy, because the person closest to Castellano was Nino Gaggi. Although Castellano despised Roy, since he was a Neapolitan and therefore considered by the Sicilian gangsters as unreliable, Nino kept putting in a good word for him. Being a man with a strong sense of duty, Roy had no trouble showing that he had what it took. Becoming a made man was his goal, and that meant getting attention for his feats. Making money was one of them, but the other, killing people, he developed into such a grisly art form that stronger men with greater status actually feared him. Castellano listened to the rumors about him with concern. He wanted no cowboys in the family, going off and killing for the hell of it. He told Nino he did not want Roy to become a made member of the family. Roy thought it was just a matter of turning more money over to him, so he redoubled his efforts in his illegal businesses. He made deals with the Irish gangs on the west side, bringing in 10% of their business. Nino told this to Big Paul, who could not help but be impressed. Once Paul decided to make some changes in the family roster, Nino once again advanced Roy's name for the status of made man, and Paul once again refused. Yet he eventually acquiesced on the strength of Roy's ability to negotiate with the troublesome West Side gang. And finally, Roy DeMeo got his button. He was a member of the Gambino family. He pledged his allegiance to Omerta, the Sicilian code, and knew there was no getting out of this alive. However, he continued to deal in drugs, despite the rule against it, and he was drawing the FBI's attention. His reputation as a killer was of interest to them. That's what concerned Paul Castellano. When the crew killed a man who had offered information to a grand jury, along with shooting his young mistress and leaving their bodies to be found, It was clear to Castellano that Roy was acting on his own initiative. He had performed 2 murders that had not been discussed or approved by his superiors, and there would be more. But Castellano had his own problems. With breaches in security, made men wearing wires, and murmuring among family members that his leadership style was weak, Big Paul had to watch his back. The FBI was always there, just waiting for a chance at him. We had what I believe was one of the first court-authorized video installations on an organized crime case, said an FBI agent who had done surveillance on Castellano's enterprise. This was around 1975 or 76, as best I recall. We targeted Castellano's loan shark operation and managed to install a hidden video camera, along with microphones in what was their loan sharking headquarters. No microwave transmission then. We had to hardwire everything and monitor it from a nearby Catholic school. Every day the money would come pouring in from various collection points to their location. We had them on camera counting the money, stacking it in piles, and checking their lists as to who paid and who didn't, etc. They had compromised a loan officer from a branch bank and would send their clients to the bank, where the loan officer would make sure the paperwork was right for their loan. In effect, they were using the bank's money for their loan sharking operation, skimming the vig off the top, and, most of the time, the bank got repaid as well. It was a sweet deal, until, as one of the thugs explained to me in flawless Brooklynese as we raided the place, "Yous guys are f***ing this all up." Castellano withdrew out of the social clubs, meeting with members less often. And since Roy was not called on the carpet for his crimes, he expanded and empowered his killing crew. The years from 1977 to 79 were their most prolific, and anyone who got in the way or tried to cheat the crew on deals seemed to disappear. Even members of the crew were vulnerable, and it wasn't long before one of them, acting on his own initiative, got himself into big trouble. Sometimes Chris Rosenberg, who felt like a son to Roy, would introduce himself as Chris DeMeo. Also like Roy, he would go out on his own in business deals. When a drug deal went bad in 1979 with some Cubans in Florida, Roy learned that Chris had scammed them using his last name, DeMeo. Chris had also told them that he had a powerful father living in Brooklyn, and he was involved with 3 Cubans and 2 Jewish men who had gone to New York and had disappeared. That means that when the Cubans came looking for the man who had stiffed them and possibly snuffed their associates, Roy's family would be right in the line of fire. That was unforgivable. Yet Chris was like a son to Roy, and when the Cubans told him what would satisfy them, he blanched. They wanted Chris dead, with a notice in the newspaper that it had been accomplished. Otherwise, they would come looking for him themselves. Nino had his nephew instruct Roy to take care of it, but Roy stalled for several weeks, and the order was given again. Still, Roy stalled and withdrew into his home, paranoid that the Cubans would come looking for him. At one point, he spotted a dark-haired young man sitting in a Cadillac outside his home, apparently looking through some papers. Roy's wife, Gladys, said that the man had come to the door that day trying to sell a vacuum cleaner. It seemed an unlikely story to Roy. He felt sure it was just a way to see if Roy lived there. In light of the fact that the man was still hanging around in the neighborhood, and that he certainly looked Hispanic, Roy decided to take action and save his family. He and a cousin who was there with him got guns and went outside to confront the man. Roy went marching out to the car. The man looked up, started his car, and drove off, with Roy in his own car tailing him and shooting at him. After 7 miles, Roy caught up and shot the man 7 times, killing him. Then he went back home, herded his wife and 3 children into the car, and took them to a hideout. When they eventually came home, Roy learned what he had done. The Cuban outside his house had been an 18-year-old college student, Dominic Ragucci, who was legitimately selling vacuum cleaners door to door as a way to put himself through college. Roy had made a mistake. He sold his Cadillac, and according to his son, Albert, in For the Sins of My Father, Roy wept over the murder of an innocent civilian. It was one thing to kill other soldiers, or to kill informants, or people who double-crossed him on a deal, but this boy should not have died. Albert viewed his father as a genuinely caring man who was devastated by this error. And yet, the Chris Rosenberg situation was still up in the air. Roy knew he had to act. Calling the crew together one night without Chris, Roy told the others that he would do the shooting. He had brought Chris into the life. He would take him out. As hard as it was for him, he had a duty. This was part of being a made man. The incident took place on May 19, 1979. Roy asked Chris to come, and after Chris had greeted Roy with a kiss on the cheek, Roy shot him in the head. The others finished the job and put the body into Chris's car so it would be found and reported. That settled the Cuban crisis, but another one was on its heels. This time, a family member was telling Castellano that Nino and Roy were dealing drugs, so Nino decided that the man and his son had to disappear. Yet the job was badly botched and got Nino arrested, while Roy ran off. The murders continued unabated, even as Nino got out on bail. Detectives began to link some of them, and the crew began to fall apart. Nino's attempts to foil his convictions failed, and he went to Attica. He picked Roy as his stand-in man, which did not please Big Paul, who was growing tired of all the killings. Nino had no idea yet how this arrangement would contribute to his downfall. For the crew, Henry and Freddie were arrested for 2 murders. They were also tied to the stolen car ring. Soon the other crew members were under investigation, but Nino's conviction was overturned and he was out. Yet the FBI agents watching them were putting more pressure on everyone, from Paul Castellano on down the line. The government had a powerful weapon in the RICO law, or Racketeering Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, enacted to go after mafia crime families. It allowed witness protection, wiretaps, and the power to impanel grand juries. The penalties for such criminal enterprises were stiff, even just for membership. Assistant U.S. Attorney Walter Mack took over the case, looking for anyone who would implicate Roy DeMeo in murder, and he was a bulldog. The task force kept pressuring Roy, who grew more agitated, just as they hoped. Finally, they got a break with the arrest of a crew member, Vito Arena, who began to roll at once. He described the murders in which he had been involved and even showed investigators some of the body dump sites. Roy soon found out that Vito was a government witness, so he made himself scarce. The police delivered a grand jury subpoena to his home. Roy told Nino and Paul about Vito's defection, and Paul realized that Vito knew about him as well. Roy would have to go before a grand jury, and he could not be trusted. The FBI's surveillance equipment picked up a conversation in which John Gotti was asked, on behalf of Big Paul, to accept a contract on Roy. Gotti declined because Roy's gang was known to be dangerous. Big Paul finally ordered an end to those things that were getting them all into trouble, notably the drugs and the members who were acting out too much. He gave Nino the task of taking care of Roy DeMeo, as depicted in Boss of Bosses, saying that DeMeo loved killing too much. Nino had brought him into this life, in a way, so he would take him out. Roy's son, Albert, writes about how frightened his father was during those days, and how he would take his son aside to ask him to do things in preparation for Roy's sudden departure. Roy was thinking about going into the wind, as mobsters referred to being on the run, but he also realized that he might be killed. He'd brought trouble down on the family, and someone was going to end his connection with them, one way or another. He was right. Before the government could have their way, the family got him first. Albert DeMeo grew up with a fairly good idea of what his father was doing, although he was later shocked by photos he saw during a grand jury hearing, and by what he read in Munstein's and Capicci's book, Murder Machine. He once told a girlfriend that if she wanted to understand him, she should read about Michael Corleone in The Godfather. While his mother gave him a Bible to read, his father gave him Niccolò Machiavelli's political treatise, The Prince, seemingly the blueprint for the Italian underworld. Albert found the book fascinating. After serving 14 years as a secretary to the Second Chancery of the Signoria in the Florentine Republic, Machiavelli had fallen out of power in 1512. He wrote that religion and morals have no place in the rise to power. A prince cannot indulge in the virtues of goodness because, to hold power, he must be a lion and a fox. In other words, he must rely on such traits as cruelty, craftiness, mercilessness, and dishonesty. If necessary, he should not hesitate to break promises. He must ally himself with his own kind, choose wise counselors, and do whatever must be done in the name of power. The survival of the fittest was the ultimate game, and even the closest of alliances could be betrayed. Pulled into this world before he could understand it, Albert found himself torn between utter devotion to his father and disgust over what he was sometimes asked to do. At the age of 13, he was putting a gun in his backpack to go to school. He saw things, but never imagined the extent to which his father was fully involved in crime, including multiple murders. In a literate memoir, Albert describes what it was like to grow up in a family where his father made a fortune through criminal ventures, and his mother, like many other wives in these families, allowed herself to be protected from knowing how she and her children were being supported in such a grand lifestyle. This was the way of the Mafia. The men engaged in their war, but the women were to be protected from knowing anything about it. In the end, this system inevitably broke down, since mobsters often shot those who made them paranoid or whom they felt had betrayed them, and it was difficult for the women to ignore the violence by which their husbands and sons had lived and died. The men seemed to want their families to exist in this pure arena, wherein they could view themselves as somewhat genteel. At home among family, they could forget their own self-loathing over what they felt they had to do. Their home was the pristine castle, the place where they could exercise the part of themselves they most wanted others to believe they were. For example, they swore freely in the bars and ogled half-naked women, but did not swear at home. They had sex all over the place away from home, but the members of their home life were to be faithful. They killed, lied, and stole without compunction, but this is not an acceptable part of their family man identity. While these men had a supreme ability to compartmentalize, to be psychopathic in one venue but caring and good in another, their families were also viewed as idealized extensions of a part of themselves. It was another area of control. Family members, especially wives, were not allowed to be people in their own right. They were to play a role that suited the mobster's purpose. Albert felt some of this and was largely protected, but his father ended up bringing him partly into the Cosa Nostra, our thing, by introducing him to members of the notorious crime crew and by asking him to learn to use a gun, potentially for criminal purposes. He did not witness a dismemberment, and he often underestimated the potential for brutality in someone he met at the Gemini Lounge. So it came as a shock to him to learn more about his father's activities via other reports. According to his reaction, he did not quite believe the full story. After Roy was found dead in the trunk of his Cadillac, the very thing that he most wanted to prevent happened. His family suffered for his crimes. His wife, finally brought into public awareness through media stories, ultimately sold the dream house into which Roy had moved his family, while Albert spiraled into a deep suicidal depression, which he documents in detail in his revealing memoir. Mafia life had been far from glamorous, he writes, and despite the fine clothing, nice cars, and high standard of living, Roy had inflicted a lot of psychological damage on the people around him. Albert had realized by the age of 10 that his father's occupation was different, and unlike other kids, he had nothing much to share at school. He knew that his father carried a gun and kept odd hours. As the years passed, tension mounted and his father became increasingly more paranoid. He was away from the family more, and he gave the adolescent Albert charge of protecting his mother and sisters, and even took him on a few jobs. It was a poor legacy to hand down. When Albert was only 15, Roy enlisted him in a plan to fake his death, should the need arise. When Roy was killed 2 years later, Albert had to identify his body and avoid the FBI's intense scrutiny. Seeking revenge, he was nearly killed. Eventually, his life fell apart, his wife left, and he was faced with the realization that his father's life of crime had taken a terrible toll. He would not forget the bloody fate to which his father's crimes had consigned him, the body in the morgue, the crime scene photos, the photographs of victims. It was only after he read Murder Machine that he understood how truly brutal the man he adored could be. He also learned from an insider about the intimate betrayal within the family that had brought his father down, just as Roy DeMeo had done to Chris Rosenberg. Fearing that Roy might become a cooperating witness for the government, Castellano had ordered Nino to take care of him. Nino was a man whom Roy trusted, so when Nino invited him one day for a meeting, he went. Nino met him, along with the Gemini twins. Roy took off his leather jacket, and Nino fired at his head. He was hit 7 times, including the symbolic bullets that the twins put into his skull, behind the ears. Then they put him into the trunk of his car, placed the chandelier over him that he was taking to get repaired, and parked him at the club in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. The government had lost Roy DeMeo as a witness, but they had not lost Nino or Paul. They continued to look for evidence against these men. Nino was arrested in 1984 and released on bail. He was eventually convicted of a conspiracy to steal cars and sentenced to 5 years. On these same charges, Joey Testa and Anthony Center, the Gemini twins, were acquitted. Then they were all brought up, along with the other crew members, on multiple counts of murder. Before the trial was over, Nino, 62, died in prison. The others were convicted. Eventually, thanks to a bug in Castellano's home and surveillance photos of a meeting of the heads of the crime families, the grand jury returned an indictment against everyone at the meeting, including Castellano. Before he went to trial, however, John Gotti made a power play to become head of the Gambino family by having Castellano assassinated in front of Sparks Steakhouse on December 16, 1985. When John Gotti's underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano, testified against Gotti in the trial in which Gotti was convicted of his part in the murder of Castellano, Gravano also recalled Castellano's lack of reaction to DeMeo's demise. Apparently, when one accepts the life, one accepts whatever form of death comes with it.
On July 30th, 1975, former Teamsters president Jimmy Hoffa stood outside the Macus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, Michigan, impatiently scanning the parking lot. The man who had made the Teamsters the most formidable labor union in the country was already angry. It was 2:15 in the afternoon, and the men he was supposed to be meeting for lunch hadn't arrived yet. Hoffa was a stickler for punctuality, and it was his understanding that they were to meet at 2 p.m. Wearing a dark blue short-sleeve shirt, blue pants, white socks, and black Gucci loafers, Hoffa walked to a nearby payphone outside a hardware store and called his wife to tell her that he'd apparently been stood up. Josephine Hoffa had felt that her husband seemed uncharacteristically nervous when he had left the house an hour earlier. Before going to the restaurant, Hoffa had stopped at the offices of a limousine service in Pontiac that was owned by a good friend. An employee there also noticed that Hoffa seemed nervous. Jimmy Hoffa was supposed to meet Detroit mobster Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone and New Jersey labor leader Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano, who also happened to be a made member of the Genovese crime family. The reason for this meeting, Hoffa believed, was to discuss his intention to run for the presidency of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters and regain the powerful position he had lost after his 1964 convictions for jury tampering, conspiracy, and mail and wire fraud. But the Mafia, who had worked hand in hand with Hoffa in the past, wasn't so sure they wanted him back in power. President Richard Nixon had granted Hoffa clemency in 1971, just before Christmas, but things had changed significantly in the nearly 5 years Hoffa had spent behind bars. The mob found Hoffa's hand-picked successor, Frank Fitzsimmons, more pliable than Hoffa, and Fitzsimmons was well-liked by President Nixon. The gangsters liked things the way they were. They wanted Hoffa to stay retired. Not long after Hoffa called home on the payphone outside the hardware store, a maroon 1975 Mercury Marquis Brougham pulled out of the restaurant parking lot and nearly hit a truck. The truck driver, who was making deliveries in the area, pulled up next to the car and immediately recognized Jimmy Hoffa sitting in the back seat behind the car's driver. The truck driver also noticed a long object covered with a gray blanket on the seat between Hoffa and another passenger. The truck driver thought it was a shotgun or a rifle. He didn't get a good look at anyone else in the car. The next day, Hoffa's green 1974 Pontiac Grandville was found unlocked in the restaurant parking lot. Police opened the trunk, but found nothing unusual. Using the truck driver's description of the car Hoffa was last seen in, investigators were able to trace the maroon Mercury to its owner, Joe Giacalone, the son of mobster Anthony Giacalone. Joe Giacalone claimed that he had lent the car to a friend that day, a teamster named Charles Chucky O'Brien, who was very close to the Hoffa family and had actually lived with the Hoffas at one time. The car was located, and Brian's fingerprints were found on a 7-Up bottle and a piece of paper recovered from the car. Investigators felt that Jimmy Hoffa would have felt comfortable enough with O'Brien, whom he considered a foster son, to get into the Mercury. FBI agents checked on the whereabouts of the 2 men Hoffa was supposed to be meeting that day. Tony Jack Giacalone swore he was at the gym where he worked out every day, and witnesses placed him at the Southfield Athletic Club at the time of Hoffa's disappearance. Tony Pro Provenzano was in New Jersey playing cards with friends. Both Tonys said they knew nothing about a scheduled meeting with Hoffa. Chucky O'Brien claimed that he hadn't seen Hoffa on July 30th and gave a detailed account of his whereabouts. He told investigators that he had delivered a 40-pound frozen salmon to the home of a Teamster International vice president and helped the man's wife cut the fish into steaks. During the time that Jimmy Hoffa had been waiting at the restaurant, O'Brien said he was at the Southfield Athletic Club with Anthony Giacalone. O'Brien claimed that he then took the Mercury to a car wash because fish blood had leaked onto the back seat. No one at the athletic club or the car wash could corroborate his story. Specially trained German Shepherds were flown in from Philadelphia 8 days after Hoffa's disappearance. The dogs were given a pair of the labor leader's Bermuda shorts and a pair of his moccasins. They picked up Hoffa's scent in the back seat and trunk of Joe Giacalone's maroon Mercury. 26 years later, in March of 2001, a DNA match was made between a hair found in the back of the car and a hair taken from Hoffa's hairbrush. Many years have passed since the mysterious disappearance of James Riddle Hoffa, and the case remains unsolved. But this mystery is not a whodunit. The likely suspects are all known, and their motives are well documented. The question is, where? What exactly did they do to Jimmy Hoffa, and where did they dispose of his body? In 1959, Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, who would soon be elected President of the United States, appeared on The Jack Paar Show, America's first late-night television talk show. At the time, Bobby Kennedy was chief counsel of the Senate Labor Rackets Committee, better known as the McClellan Committee. Speaking to a national television audience, Kennedy had plenty to say about Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters Union, and the crusading young attorney was not afraid to name names. Sitting across from an attentive Jack Paar, their images broadcast across America in grainy black and white, Kennedy said, "All of our lives are too intricately interwoven with this union to sit passively by and allow the Teamsters under Mr. Hoffa's leadership to create such a superpower in this country. A power greater than the people and greater than the government. Unless something is done, this country is not going to be controlled by the people, but is going to be controlled by Johnny Dio and Jimmy Hoffa and Tony Dux Corallo." Except for Hoffa's, those names were probably unfamiliar to most Americans, but the directness of Kennedy's accusations was courageous and remarkable. What public official today would go on The Tonight Show and point the fingers at gangsters using their real names? In the late 1950s, the McClellan Committee, named after its chairman, Senator John L. McClellan, was set up to investigate the influence of organized crime in labor unions. Though Robert Kennedy knew relatively little about organized labor when the committee began its work, the young attorney from Massachusetts was a quick study and a tenacious public servant. He made no bones about his desire to get Hoffa. Kennedy could not abide corruption at any level, and by all indications, the leadership of the Teamsters Union was rotten to the core. Hoffa had always been a brawler and a bully who would use any means necessary to achieve his goals for the Teamsters. When he and Kennedy locked horns in the public arena, Hoffa, as was his way, insisted on making it personal, ridiculed Kennedy and calling him a boy. When the two men first met at a Washington dinner party, Hoffa had actually challenged Kennedy to an arm wrestling contest, and the next day publicly proclaimed victory. On another occasion at a restaurant, Hoffa initiated a shoving match with Kennedy because he felt that the young attorney had snubbed him. Kennedy was everything Hoffa loathed: born into money, Ivy League educated, refined and good-looking. But in Hoffa's estimation, Kennedy fell short because he didn't live up to Hoffa's standards for manhood. Hoffa believed that a real man should be able to handle himself with his fists, intimidating his adversaries physically when words weren't enough. He also believed in any means to an end. According to Hoffa, the only thing that mattered was success, no matter how it was achieved. And to Hoffa's way of thinking, dealing with gangsters was necessary for the success of the Teamsters. But in fact, dealing with Hoffa was more necessary for the success of the mob. While the mob provided Hoffa with the kind of muscle he valued, Hoffa provided the mob with money. Lots of it. The jackpot in question was the Central States Pension Fund. The hard-working rank and file of the Teamsters entrusted the union with their retirement savings, with the promise that it would be invested soundly and yield the highest dividends possible. But under Hoffa,
loans were made out to such dubious individuals as Jewish gangster Morris Mo Dalitz, one of the underworld's architects of Las Vegas. Dalitz, who started as a member of the notorious Purple Gang in Detroit before moving his base of operations to Cleveland, used money loaned from the Teamsters Pension Fund to build the Grand Desert Inn and the Stardust Hotel in Vegas. According to Ralph and Estelle James in their book Hoffa and the Teamsters, Dalitz was a member of Hoffa's inner circle. In 1949, when the Teamsters threatened to strike against the Detroit Laundry Institute, Dalitz, who was a part owner in a laundry, got Hoffa to intervene behind the scenes and managed to avert the strike. The McClellan Committee uncovered evidence that the grateful laundry owners of Detroit kicked back a substantial sum of money to Hoffa disguised as a loan. Mobster Johnny Dio, who was cited by Robert Kennedy on television, was considered the master of labor racketeering. Born Johnny DioGuardi, he wrote the book on how to profit from labor unions and was welcomed by mob families across the country, eager to learn from him. Dio would open garment factories, then negotiate sweetheart deals with the unions that granted him waivers from every major contractual obligation contained in their labor agreements. In this way, Dio was able to use underpaid, non-union immigrant labor in his factories, allowing him to undercut his competitors. In exchange for their cooperation, union officials were given generous kickbacks. It cannot be said, the McClellan Committee concluded, using the widest possible latitude, that John DioGuardi was ever interested in the lot of the working man. One of Johnny Dio's partners in labor crime was Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo, who earned his nickname not because he loved waterfowl, but because he had an uncanny ability to duck convictions in court. Dio and Corallo set up 6 paper locals in New York with Jimmy Hoffa's blessing. These locals had no members, only officials who were either made members or associates of the Mafia. And eventually, these men were able to take control of all airport trucking in New York City. According to the McClellan Committee, these mobsters used their positions for purposes of extortion, bribery, and shakedowns. In exchange for this extraordinary license to steal, Hoffa expected the paper locals to support him when it came time to vote in Teamster elections. According to Stephen Fox in Blood and Power, the McClellan Committee uncovered a pattern of squandered and stolen union funds, sweetheart contracts, conflicts of interest among employers and labor leaders, phony paper locals and denial of democratic process to members, collusions and coercion, and violence always about to break out in cities across the country, including New York, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, and Minneapolis. Hoffa's associates in organized crime included Angelo Melli, William Buffalino, and Pete Licavoli of Detroit, Babe Triscaro of Cleveland, Paul Rica and Joey Glimko of Chicago, and Johnny Dio, Tony Ducks Corallo, and Vincent Squillante of New York. But as Fox points out, Hoffa took cues, not orders, from gangsters, and that's where his troubles began. On Valentine's Day 1970, a small airplane towing a long banner flew low over Lewisburg Federal Prison in central Pennsylvania. The banner proclaimed, "Happy birthday, Jimmy." It was Jimmy Hoffa's 57th birthday. He had been incarcerated for almost 5 years. Hoffa received lots of birthday cards from loyal rank-and-file members and Teamster officials in addition to the usual stream of encouraging letters. But the support that Hoffa was getting through the mail was deceptive. Though he was still a hero to the workers he had represented, the corrupt Teamster leadership was just as happy to have him on ice. Hoffa's hand-picked successor for the presidency of the union, Frank Fitzsimmons, was much more to their liking. Fitzsimmons didn't merely take cues from the gangsters. He practically gave them carte blanche to do whatever they wanted with their union positions. The even-tempered Fitzsimmons was also much easier to get along with than the pugnacious Hoffa. In addition, he was a friend of President Nixon and a frequent guest at the White House. Fitzsimmons' air of respectability was the perfect cover for the corruption lurking beneath the Teamsters. Hoffa, on the other hand, was now a con, not the most desirable image for a frontman. But Hoffa was undaunted. He was determined to regain his seat of power, even though the Landrum-Griffin Act stipulated that a convicted felon could not hold office in a union until 5 years after his release. Hoffa knew he would have to bide his time. His plan was to finish his sentence and wait out the mandatory exclusionary period, then mount his campaign against the lackluster Fitzsimmons, who consistently disregarded Hoffa's suggestions for the Teamsters in favor of the mob's wishes. Hoffa was confident that he had the support of the rank and file, and he believed they would sweep him back into the office. But while in prison, he also tried to shore up his mob alliances. A high-ranking mobster with close ties to the Teamsters happened to be serving time at Lewisburg on an extortion conviction. Hoffa's old friend, Anthony Tony Provenzano. Provenzano was a capo in the Genovese crime family, as well as an international brotherhood of Teamsters vice president, controlling the most corrupt local in the country, Local 560 in Union City, New Jersey. Provenzano's position with the union was a long-standing quid pro quo devised by Hoffa himself, who had been seeking to solidify his mob support. Local 560 eventually became Tony Pro's personal piggy bank, allowing him easy access to union funds for his own illegitimate purposes. In prison, Hoffa and Provenzano were initially close allies. Provenzano was a de facto power within Lewisburg, carrying his mob rank with him, and he provided Hoffa with protection. At one point, Provenzano was paralyzed with a painful stomach ailment, and it was Hoffa who raised hell on his behalf, convincing prison officials to get Provenzano the medical attention he required. But over time, their relationship deteriorated. Provenzano wanted Hoffa's help in securing a loan from the Teamsters for a restaurant he wanted to open, but Hoffa couldn't deliver for him. Provenzano was upset over this, and later Hoffa was overheard telling Provenzano, "It's because of people like you that I got into trouble in the first place." After they were both released from Lewisburg, a federal informant claimed to have witnessed a violent confrontation between Provenzano and Hoffa at a chance meeting at an airport. According to Lester Velli in Desperate Bargain, Why Jimmy Hoffa Had to Die, Hoffa and Provenzano went at it with their fists, and Hoffa broke a bottle over Provenzano's head. Provenzano angrily threatened Hoffa's grandchildren, swearing, "I'll tear your heart out." Hoffa opposed Provenzano's intention to return to his old position with Local 560 after his 5-year exclusionary period. And likewise, Provenzano opposed Hoffa's desire to recapture the presidency of the Teamsters. They became each other's problem, but Provenzano had a reputation for making his problems disappear. In 1963, a prosecution witness in Provenzano's extortion trial was gunned down shortly before he was scheduled to give testimony. In 1972, a man involved in a counterfeiting operation with Provenzano simply disappeared. In a case uncannily similar to the Hoffa disappearance, Anthony Castellitto, the secretary-treasurer of Provenzano's Local 560, was lured to a location in upstate New York where he was met by a short, slight, and bespectacled loan shark named Salvatore "Sallybugs" Bruguglio, who allegedly murdered Castellitto and transported the body back to New Jersey. Castellitto's remains were never found. Conveniently, Provenzano was in Florida at the time of Castellitto's disappearance. The setup was nearly identical to Hoffa's disappearance. When Provenzano returned to the Garden State, he appointed Bruguglio, who previously had no official connection to the Teamsters, to the victim's former position as Secretary-Treasurer of Local 560. In 1985, the FBI released a memo summarizing the Hoffa case and cited Salvatore Bruguglio as a prime suspect, along with Bruguglio's brother Gabriel and brothers Stephen and Thomas Andretta, Chucky O'Brien, Tony Provenzano, Tony Jack Giacalone, and the mob boss of Western Pennsylvania, Russell Bufalino. In January 1976 and February 1977, the government issued internal reports based on interviews with an informer who claimed to know the whole story of what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. The informer, Ralph Picardo, was serving a murder sentence at the time in Trenton State Prison in New Jersey's capital. Picardo had been a business agent for Local 84 in New Jersey and a driver for Tony Provenzano. As reported in The Hoffa Wars by Dan E. Moldea, Picardo claimed that Hoffa had been invited to the Macus Red Fox restaurant by Detroit mobster Anthony Giacalone for a sit-down with Provenzano so that the two men could iron out their differences. Chucky O'Brien, whose alibi included spending time carving a large fish that day, picked up Hoffa at the restaurant and took him to a nearby house where O'Brien had been staying with friends. Teamster business agent Thomas Andretta, Salvatore Bruguglio, and his brother Gabriel were in the house, waiting to ambush Hoffa. A man named Frank Sheeran, who had been president of Local 326 in Delaware, was also in the house. Sheeran was a close associate of Pennsylvania mob boss Russell Bufalino and had driven Bufalino to Detroit that day. According to Picardo, the hit on Hoffa was ordered by Bufalino, who gave the contract to Provenzano. Bufalino's cousin William, president of the Teamsters Jukebox Local in Detroit, had had a serious falling out with Hoffa in 1967. Picardo did not say whether Russell Bufalino was actually present for Hoffa's execution, but it is curious that on a day when others involved in the conspiracy made sure they were nowhere in the vicinity, Bufalino traveled from his base in Pittston, Pennsylvania, to be in the same city. Perhaps Bufalino wanted to make sure that the pesky Hoffa was taken care of once and for all. Or perhaps it was personal, and he wanted to witness the event himself. Bufalino's exact whereabouts on July 30th, 1975 are unknown, but there's little doubt that Hoffa was murdered that day in that house. Without a body or circumstantial evidence that will hold up in court, there will probably never be a conviction in the slaying of Jimmy Hoffa, but the conspirators did not get off scot-free. Over the years, the government made sure these men were prosecuted to the full extent of the law on other charges. Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano's pocket Local 560, eventually came under government oversight, putting a major crimp in Provenzano's illegal operations. In 1978, he was prosecuted and found guilty of the 1961 murder of Anthony Castellitto. 17 years after Castellitto's body was allegedly put through a tree shredder, Tony Pro was sent to prison, where he died 10 years later at the age of 81. Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, who allegedly set up Hoffa, was tried and convicted on tax evasion charges and spent 10 years in prison. He was charged with racketeering violations in 1996, but died before the case could be tried. Despite numerous holes in Chucky O'Brien's alibi, the man who allegedly drove Hoffa to his execution was never charged with anything relating to Hoffa's disappearance. He moved to Florida, where he was given a job by Teamster president Frank Fitzsimmons, but in 1990, O'Brien was banished from the union for his mob connections. He served a short time in prison in the late 70s for accepting a free car from an auto dealership and for lying on a loan application. Plagued with ill health, O'Brien had survived cancer and 4 heart bypass operations and spent most of his remaining days in Boca Raton, Florida. He kept his version of the events, saying that the government, not the mob, killed Jimmy Hoffa. Chucky O'Brien died of a heart attack in February 2020 at the age of 86. Tony Pro associate Salvatore Brigiglio was murdered gangland style on Mulberry Street in New York's Little Italy. 2 gunmen pumped several shots into his chest and head. At the time, he had been talking with prosecutors and was about to make a deal in exchange for his testimony against Provenzano in the Castellitto murder case. Authorities know who killed Jimmy Hoffa, and they know why, but the question that remains is where. What did Hoffa's killers do with his body? Theories, both credible and ridiculous, abound, and some incarcerated felons seem to amuse themselves by cooking up scenarios for eager journalists salivating for the scoop of the century. Tons of earth has been moved in the search for Jimmy Hoffa's remains. The following are just a few of the leads that didn't pan out. According to Ralph Picardo, the convict who fingered the conspirators, Hoffa's body was put in a 55-gallon steel drum and carted away in a Gateway transportation truck. Picardo said he didn't know where it was taken. According to another jailbird, Hoffa's body was taken to New Jersey, where it was mixed into the concrete that was used to construct the New York Giants football stadium in East Rutherford, New Jersey. Hoffa was said to have been buried in a 100-acre gravel pit in Highland, Michigan, which was owned by his brother, William. Hoffa's body was encased in the foundation of a Public Works garage in Cadillac, Michigan. His remains were buried at the bottom of a swimming pool behind a mansion in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. His corpse was ground up and dumped in a Florida swamp. Hoffa was crushed in an automobile compactor at Central Sanitation Services in Hamtramck, Michigan. His body was buried in a field in Waterford Township, Michigan. It was weighted down and dumped in Michigan's Ausable River. Hoffa's remains were disintegrated at a fat rendering plant. He was buried under the helipad at the Sheraton Savannah Resort Hotel, which at the time of his disappearance was owned by the Teamsters. His body was put in a steel drum and buried on the grounds of Brother Moscato's garbage dump, a toxic waste site in Jersey City, New Jersey. Jimmy Hoffa was declared legally dead in 1982, but his case remains open. Like a perpetual flame, a special agent at the FBI's Detroit field office is constantly assigned to it. The investigation has generated over 16,000 pages of documents gathered from interviews, wiretaps, and surveillance.
But despite the government's best efforts to get to the bottom of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, what the mob did with the body remains a question mark.